Hey there, wanderers. Tonight, one question. What happens the second your heart beats for the last time? If you grew up in church, you picture two doors, heaven or hell, pick a lane, roll credits. Cute. But that's not what the Bible actually says. Scripture doesn't give you two doors, it hands you a map. Your soul travels through several separate realms, each one built by God for a reason. Waiting rooms for the dead, a prison for demons, 3 versions of paradise, and eventually a lake of fire. Tonight we walk the whole thing, start to finish. From your final breath all the way to forever. What happens the moment you die, where the soul actually goes, who's already waiting on the other side, and how it all ends in the book of Revelation. Buckle up, because part of this you are hearing for the first time, and before we set off, drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching from and what time it is right now. Ready? Let's go. So let's start exactly where every human story eventually lands, at that final heartbeat. Before we can follow a single soul anywhere, we have to settle a much stranger question, and it's the one almost everyone skips right over. What actually dies, and what doesn't? Get that part backwards, and the whole map crumbles before we even leave the driveway. Here's the thing the Bible insists on from its very first pages. You are not one simple object. You are a 2-part machine, bolted together out of materials that could not possibly be more different. The book of Genesis lays out the assembly in almost comically plain language. God shapes a body out of the dust of the ground, then breathes into it the breath of life, and only then does the man become a living soul. So you have plain dirt on one side, divine breath on the other, fused into a single walking, talking, snack-eating person. It's a peculiar recipe when you stop and think about it. Roughly like building a smartphone out of half wet clay and half electricity, but it worked. And it is still the exact blueprint every human being is running on today. You are dust that God taught how to think, and that dust, no matter how clever it gets, keeps a standing appointment none of us can wriggle out of. Death is the single event with a perfect attendance record. You can dodge your taxes, skip the gym, ghost your dentist for a decade, and duck out of family reunions with a convenient scheduling conflict. But this is the one meeting that never gets rescheduled and never accepts your excuse. It comes for the powerful and the forgotten, the healthy and the fragile, the people who prepared for it and the people who refuse to think about it, all on the same terms, which is oddly part of why the subject is worth staring at directly instead of flinching away. It is the one experience absolutely guaranteed to be on everyone's itinerary, so you might as well know something about the destination before the trip begins. That 2-part design matters enormously, because the moment of death is nothing more and nothing less than those 2 parts coming unbolted. The dirt half and the breath half go their separate ways. The book of Ecclesiastes describes the split with the kind of blunt honesty you rarely get at a funeral. The dust returns to the earth where it came from, and the spirit returns to God who gave it. 2 components, 2 very different forwarding addresses. One package heads down into the ground, the other heads somewhere else entirely, and understanding where that second package goes is basically the entire point of this journey. Now, the first half of that equation is the part nobody enjoys hearing about, so we will move through it quickly and with as much dignity as the subject allows. The body, the dust portion, begins doing exactly what dust does. It breaks down, it returns to the soil. From an entirely physical standpoint, you become, over time, the least glamorous recycling program in the universe. This is not a cheerful image, and unsurprisingly, the ancient world had no interest in dressing it up. But here is the crucial detail that changes everything. The Bible never once suggests that this decaying body is you. It is your old address, not your identity. The real you, the conscious, remembering, wisecracking self that has been reading these words, does not go into the ground with the leftovers. The real you follows the second package, and this is where we need to gently pull the rug out from under one of the most stubborn ideas humanity has ever invented. When most people picture a soul leaving a body, their imagination immediately reaches for the Hollywood version. A pale, translucent figure drifting through hallways, rattling chains, moaning about unfinished business, and refusing to move furniture out of anyone's living room. The wandering ghost, doomed to haunt the same drafty mansion for eternity because it took a wrong turn on the way out. It's a fantastic setup for a movie. It is also, according to Scripture, completely made up. The Bible does not describe the soul as a lost, aimless phantom bumping into walls and forgetting where it parked. It does not describe the soul dissolving into a cosmic mist or evaporating like steam off a coffee cup either. The soul does not lose its mind, its memory, or its sense of self. It goes somewhere specific, on purpose, with full awareness intact. It is worth pausing on where that ghost picture even came from, because it did not fall out of the sky. Nearly every culture on Earth cooked up some version of the restless spirit, the shade, the shadow that lingers, and you can understand the instinct. Death is the ultimate unknown, and the human imagination absolutely hates an unknown, so it rushes in to fill the silence with something, anything, even chains and moaning. Add a few thousand years of campfire stories, a couple of centuries of Gothic novels, and roughly 100 years of cinema very eager to sell you a fright, and you end up with a cultural default setting that has almost nothing to do with the text people claim it comes from. The biblical writers, for their part, seem strangely uninterested in the haunted house genre. They never treat the dead as trapped, aimless, or stuck rearranging your kitchen at midnight. They treat them as having gone somewhere, a real destination with a real location, which is a far less spooky idea and, unfortunately for the horror industry, a far more orderly one. We know this because one of the most famous figures in the New Testament, the Apostle Paul, talks about his own expected death with the casual confidence of a man describing a business trip. He does not describe dying as falling into a black void or ceasing to exist. He describes it as being absent from the body and present with the Lord, as if the body were simply a coat he would take off at the door. In another letter he goes even further, saying he would honestly prefer to depart and be with Christ, calling that option far better than sticking around. Read that carefully. You do not casually rank an option as far better than your current life if that option is unconsciousness or non-existence. Paul talks about the moment after death the way you might talk about finally getting home after a very long, very exhausting day, which when you think about the life he had, is a pretty relatable way to feel about it. There is something almost enviable about that calm. Most of us approach the subject of our own death the way a cat approaches a bathtub, with maximum resistance and a strong preference for the exit. Paul approaches it like a traveller who has already read the itinerary and knows the destination is good. And notice what his confidence quietly tells us about the place itself. You do not describe a departure as far better than your present life if you are heading toward a filing cabinet in a dark basement. His serenity is itself a kind of evidence, a description smuggled inside an attitude. And while we are here, it is worth defending the dust half from the insult of being called mere leftovers, because the Bible has a surprisingly high opinion of the body. It is not a prison the soul is lucky to escape, and it is not garbage to be discarded and forgotten. It was called good back when it was first shaped from the ground, and without spoiling where all of this is heading, the body's not actually gone for keeps. The dirt portion has a return ticket, though it will be quite a while before it gets cashed in. For now, simply hold the thought that when the body goes into the earth, it is being set down, not thrown away, a distinction that turns out to matter enormously by the end of the journey. So for someone who trusts God, the Bible frames death not as a pause, not as a long, dreamless nap, and definitely not as a game over screen. It frames it as a doorway you walk through without so much as breaking stride. 1 second you're on this side, the next second you're on the other, and there is no awkward gap in between where you sit in the dark twiddling your thumbs. The transition is immediate. The lights do not flicker off and then back on years later. You simply change rooms. That single phrase, change rooms, is doing a lot of quiet work, and it is worth dwelling on because it corrects two opposite mistakes at once. On one side are the people who imagine death as pure annihilation, the self simply switched off like a lamp, the story deleted mid-sentence. On the other side are the people who imagine a long unconscious wait, a sleep so deep you would not even register the passage of centuries. Paul's confidence undercuts both. There is no deletion because he expects to be present with someone the very moment he leaves. And there is no dark waiting either, at least not for him, because he calls the next step far better than now, rather than a long nap he would have to sleep off first. The self keeps going, and it keeps going right away. Whatever else death is, in his telling it is not an ending, and it is not an intermission. It is a threshold, and thresholds are meant to be stepped over, not lingered on. But, and this is the twist that sets up everything ahead, it was not always this simple, and it was not always this pleasant. The instant welcome home version of death that Paul describes so cheerfully is a relatively recent upgrade in the story. For the enormous stretch of history before Christ arrived, The route the soul travelled was different, the destination was different, and frankly, the accommodations were a good deal more crowded. Back then, everybody, without a single exception, ended up in the same place. Kings and beggars, heroes and villains, the deeply holy and the deeply not, all of them booked into the identical location the moment they died. Where exactly was that? That is precisely where we are headed next. Because this is the real question the entire journey hangs on, the one every human being has quietly wondered about at least once, usually at 3 a.m. If the body stays here in the dirt, then where in the world does the soul actually go? Answer that, and a plain 2-door picture of the afterlife suddenly unfolds into something far larger. A whole layered map with multiple stops, each one built for a reason. So let's find the first stop. The first territory on our map goes by 2 names, depending on which language you happen to be reading in. In Hebrew it is called Sheol, in Greek it is called Hades, and before your brain runs off with the pop culture version of that second word, the toga-wearing underworld deity with the flaming hair and the 3-headed dog, let's be clear that the biblical Hades is not a character. It is a place, and the name translates to something disarmingly simple, the land of the dead. Not a punishment, not a sentence, not the final destination anyone dreads. Just the address where the dead went to wait. The ancient Hebrews had a whole vocabulary for this address, and almost all of it pointed downward. They spoke of going down to Sheol, of descending into the pit, of sinking into the depths, into a land of silence and deep shadow where the noise of the living faded out. When the patriarch Jacob believed his favourite son had been killed, he did not put on a brave face and talk about staying positive. He said he would go down to Sheol mourning, fully expecting to join the dead in that shadowed place. Kings and poets wrote about it as somewhere quiet and dim, a country from which travellers do not send back postcards. It was not pictured as flames and pitchforks, at least not as a whole. It was pictured as down, as still, as under, the great basement of the world where every road eventually sloped, which makes it all the more striking that this dim, quiet, universal basement turns out to have had 2 very different wings. And waiting is the key word, because the single most important thing to understand about Sheol is that it is not the final hell. This trips people up constantly, so it is worth slowing down on. Sheol is a holding area, a staging ground, an enormous cosmic waiting room where souls stayed put until 2 future events arrived, the resurrection and the last judgment. If you have ever sat in a waiting room, you already grasp the basic emotional flavour of the place, the sense of being somewhere temporary, somewhere in between, somewhere that exists purely because something else has not happened yet. The main difference is that this particular waiting room had no magazines, no vending machine, and absolutely no estimate on when your number would be called. It was less like a doctor's office, and more like an airport terminal where the departures board has been switched off indefinitely, and nobody at the desk will make eye contact. And what exactly was everyone waiting for in this endless terminal? 2 things, both still far off on the horizon. They were waiting for the resurrection, the day the bodies would be raised, and they were waiting for the judgment, the day the accounts would finally be read out loud. Neither had happened yet. So the residents of Sheol existed in a kind of cosmic layover, checked in but not yet processed, present but not yet placed. It is an unsettling idea if you dwell on it, the notion of being fully aware and fully yourself while the clock on the wall has effectively been unplugged. But it also explains why Sheol feels so different from the fiery finale most people picture when they hear the word afterlife. Nothing here is final. Everyone is between chapters. The story has paused, not ended, and everyone in the building knows it. Now here is the detail that surprises most people. In the Old Testament era, everyone who died checked in here. Every single person, regardless of their resume. It did not matter whether you had been a celebrated prophet or a common thief, a righteous widow or a corrupt official. Death was the great equalizer, and Sheol was the great destination, and the guest list was, to put it mildly, all-inclusive. There was no velvet rope, no exclusive membership tier, no VIP entrance for the well-behaved. Everyone came through the same door. It is hard to overstate how strange that levelling would have sounded in the ancient world. Most cultures of the time built elaborate ladders into the afterlife, reserving the good spots for the powerful, the royal, the ones who could afford enormous tombs stuffed with gold and furniture, and, occasionally, an alarming number of servants they expected to bring along for the ride. The idea that a peasant and a monarch would end up checked into the very same building, sorted by something as invisible and unpurchasable as faith, quietly demolished the entire status system people had spent their lives climbing. You could not bribe your way to a better wing. You could not inherit a nicer spot. All the trophies stayed behind at the door with the body, which for anyone who had built their whole identity on those trophies was a genuinely alarming thought. Which raises an obvious and slightly uncomfortable question. If the saint and the scoundrel ended up in the same building, does that mean the afterlife simply did not care how you had lived? Was it all just one grey, undifferentiated basement for the entire human race? Not quite. And this is where Sheol reveals that it was never actually one uniform space. It was divided, split cleanly into two completely separate compartments, two neighbourhoods that could not have been more different from one another, and the wall between them was permanent. The question, then, was not whether you would end up in Sheol, because you would. Everyone did. The question was which side of Sheol you would wake up on. And the thing that decided that, the single factor that sorted the entire human race into one compartment or the other, was not wealth, not fame, not intelligence, not even a lifetime scorecard of good deeds versus bad ones. It came down to one thing: faith in the God of Israel. Whether you had trusted him or turned your back on him. That was the sorting mechanism, and it was surprisingly indifferent to almost everything else on your list of accomplishments. That is a genuinely counterintuitive filter, and it is worth letting it land honestly rather than rushing past it. We instinctively assume the afterlife runs on a point system, a cosmic tally where good deeds go in one column, bad deeds in the other, and at the end somebody adds it up and reads out your grade. But the sorting described here is not a grade. It is a direction. It is about whether a person had turned toward God or turned away, which is less like an exam score and more like the answer to the question of whom you trusted with your life. A brilliant, generous, widely admired person who had spent a lifetime turned away landed on one side. A poor, overlooked, unimpressive person who had quietly trusted landed on the other. If that strikes you as unfair, you are having exactly the reaction the story wants you to have, because it is deliberately overturning the scoreboard we all secretly keep. For those who had trusted God, the destination was a region Jesus later refers to as the bosom of Abraham, which is an old and rather beautiful way of describing a place of rest, comfort, and closeness. Picture the relief of finally lying down after that impossibly long day, of being welcomed somewhere warm and safe where nothing hurts anymore and nobody is chasing you. That was the good side. A waiting room, yes, still not the final glory to come, but a genuinely peaceful one, filled with the people who had died in faith, keeping company while history slowly caught up to them. For those who had rejected God, the story bends in the opposite direction, and here we need to be careful and honest rather than lurid. The other compartment is described with a single stark word: torment. It is a region of heat and anguish, of thirst that never gets answered, a place with no comfort and no relief on offer. It was, to borrow a phrase, not exactly a five-star establishment, and management was not taking complaints. This was not a pleasant lounge. But, and this is the part that matters enormously for the rest of our journey, even this was still not the final hell. It was not the lake of fire. It was not the ultimate permanent verdict. It was, like everything else in Sheol, temporary. A form of holding, not the sentence itself. The sentence came later at the judgment. Sheol was the jail cell before the trial, not the prison after it. Separating these two neighbourhoods was a single feature so important that it deserves its own spotlight: a great chasm. An immense fixed gap running down the middle of Sheol like a canyon with no bridge, no ferry, no staircase, and no maintenance crew planning to build one. And the defining property of this chasm is that it was uncrossable in both directions. Nobody in comfort could stroll over to check on the other side out of curiosity, and nobody in torment could climb across to escape. Whatever compartment you woke up in was the compartment you stayed in. This was, unfortunately, the strictest one-way policy ever enforced, and there was no customer loyalty program that let you upgrade after arrival. Where you landed was where you remained, all the way up until the resurrection changed the whole arrangement. So let's fix Sheol firmly in mind before we move on, because it is the anchor for so much of what follows. It was the land of the dead, the first stop for every soul in the ancient world. It was a temporary waiting room, not a final destination. It was split into two sealed compartments, one of rest and one of torment, sorted by faith rather than by achievement, and divided by a chasm nobody could cross. That is the starting point from which the entire rest of this story unwinds. But a description like that, laid out in tidy terms, still risks staying abstract, a diagram on a whiteboard. Fortunately, there is exactly one place in all of Scripture where the curtain gets pulled back, and we get to look inside Sheol from the inside, watching it operate through the eyes of two men who actually ended up there. And it is a story worth telling in full. It comes from the Gospel of Luke, and it involves two characters who could not have started out further apart on the social ladder. On one end you have a rich man, staggeringly wealthy, the kind of person who dressed in the most expensive purple fabric money could buy back, when purple dye was so costly it practically signalled royalty. He feasted lavishly every single day, not on holidays, not on special occasions, but daily, which even by modern standards is an impressive commitment to brunch. He lived behind a gate, in comfort so complete that discomfort had simply been engineered out of his existence. He wanted for nothing, and he arranged his life so that he would never have to look at anyone who did. Everything about the man's setup was designed for insulation. The gate was not just a door, it was a filter, a way of deciding which parts of reality got to reach him, and which parts stayed outside where he did not have to smell them. Inside, the tables never emptied, and the wine never ran low. Outside, the world could go hungry as loudly as it liked, and the wall would politely muffle the sound. It was a comfortable arrangement, the kind plenty of people would happily sign up for, and that is precisely what makes the story sting. There is nothing in the setup that reads as cartoonishly evil. He is not robbing anyone or plotting anything, he is simply comfortable and content to stay that way, and utterly untroubled by the human being dissolving on his doorstep. Sometimes the most dangerous thing a person can be is comfortable in exactly the wrong direction. On the other end you have Lazarus, and it is worth noting he is the only character in any of these particular stories that Jesus bothers to give an actual name, which tells you something about who the story is really rooting for. Lazarus was a poor man, and poor barely covers it. He was sick, covered in open sores, and so weak and destitute that he was laid down at the rich man's gate, right at the doorstep of all that abundance, hoping to survive on whatever crumbs fell from the feast happening on the other side of the wall. His only companions, the story tells us, were the local dogs, who came and licked his wounds. That was the extent of the healthcare available to him, which is to say, there was none. This was, by any measure, about as far from the daily feast and the fine purple robes as a human being could get while still being technically at the same address. That phrase, the same address, is the quiet hinge of the whole story, and Jesus clearly wants us to feel it. These two men were not separated by an ocean or a continent. They were separated by a wall and a gate, a few steps of stone. Every single day the rich man walked past a suffering human being on his way to yet another feast, and every single day he decided that the feast was more interesting than the man. It was not that he could not see Lazarus. He saw him constantly. He had simply mastered the everyday art of looking straight through someone, of treating a person as part of the scenery, like a lamppost or a hedge. And unsurprisingly, a lifetime of practiced blindness has consequences that a gate cannot fence out. And then, as it always does, death arrives for both of them, because the one thing the gate could never keep out was the ending that comes for everybody. The rich man dies, Lazarus dies, and here the story executes the single most jaw-dropping reversal in the whole scene. Lazarus, the sore-covered beggar the world had thrown away, is carried by angels, an actual escort, a delegation of the heavenly variety, to the bosom of Abraham, the good compartment, the place of rest and comfort we just described. Nobody had escorted Lazarus anywhere in life. In death, he gets an honor guard. There is something almost tender about that image. The man whom society had reduced to a heap of sores and stray dogs, whom everyone had learned to step around, is met at the end by a delegation from another realm, and carried, personally, to a place of rest. Nobody on earth had thought him worth escorting anywhere. The heavens disagreed. It is a quiet answer to the fear that haunts a lot of people late at night, the fear of dying unnoticed, unaccompanied, as if you had never mattered. The story insists that the ledger the world keeps and the ledger that actually counts are two entirely separate books, and that plenty of names scrawled in the margins of the first turn up in bold near the front of the second. The rich man, meanwhile, opens his eyes in torment. The purple robes did not come with him, the daily feast did not follow. All the wealth that had built his comfortable little kingdom turned out to be exactly the sort of thing you cannot pack. This is the beating heart of the story, the great reversal, and Jesus tells it without a trace of subtlety because he wants it to land like a hammer. The first became last, and the last became first, right on schedule. Everything the world had used to rank these two men, the robes, the feasts, the gate, the saws, the dogs, turned out to be written in disappearing ink. None of it survived the crossing. What survived was something the world had never bothered to measure, and by the time anyone could see the real scoreboard, the game was already over. It is not a comfortable message for anyone doing well, which is probably why it has made so many comfortable people vaguely uneasy for 2,000 years running. Now from inside that torment the rich man looks up, and across the great uncrossable chasm he can see them. He sees Abraham far off in the distance, and beside him, of all people, Lazarus. The beggar who used to lie in the dirt outside his gate is now resting in comfort, and the man who had everything is now the one on the outside looking in. And the rich man does something that reveals a great deal about human nature. He calls out and begs. But notice what he begs for. He does not ask to trade places. He does not even ask to be pulled across. He asks for one drop of water, a single drop, delivered on the tip of Lazarus's finger, just to cool his tongue. That is how far his circumstances have collapsed, from feasting every day to pleading for the smallest possible mercy imaginable, one bead of water. And the answer, gently but firmly delivered by Abraham, is no. Not out of cruelty, but because the chasm is fixed and no one can cross it in either direction. The request, sadly, was denied for reasons entirely beyond anyone's control on that side. What is quietly heartbreaking about the request is how small it is. This is a man who once measured his life in feasts and fine fabric, who commanded servants and controlled his entire environment, and now the whole ambition of his existence has shrunk to a single droplet of water carried on a fingertip. Everything he used to have and everything he thought made him important has been stripped down to the most basic human longing there is, the simple wish to not be in pain for 1 second. It is a portrait of how quickly the things we build our identities around can evaporate, and how, in the end, the categories the world cares about and the categories the afterlife cares about turn out to be almost entirely different lists. Sit with that scene for a moment, because packed inside this short story is a surprising amount of information about how the afterlife actually functions, and it lines up precisely with everything we have already covered. First, and most obvious, consciousness continues. Both men are fully awake, fully aware, thinking and feeling and speaking. Nobody is asleep. Nobody has evaporated. The idea of the soul dissolving into nothing takes a serious hit right here, because these two are as mentally present as they ever were on Earth, arguably more so. Second, memory survives the transition intact. The rich man remembers his earthly life in detail. He remembers his family. He remembers who Lazarus was, which means he must have known perfectly well all those years, exactly who was lying at his gate. That is a quietly devastating detail when you catch it. He had noticed Lazarus the whole time. He had simply chosen a wall over a welcome. Third, people recognize one another. The rich man knows Abraham on sight and knows Lazarus by name, so identity clearly carries over. You're still recognizably you, and so is everyone else. Fourth, the capacity to reason, to plead, to negotiate. All of it keeps working, because the rich man is doing his level best to argue his way into a better outcome, which unfortunately is not a service the afterlife offers. And fifth, we get direct confirmation of that honor guard we mentioned, the angels who carried Lazarus. The righteous, it seems, are not left to find their own way. They are escorted, which is a comforting thought for anyone who has ever dreaded facing a big transition alone. But the story is not finished, and its final beat is the one that gives it real weight. When the rich man realizes his own situation is permanent, that no drop of water is coming and no crossing is possible, his thoughts turn, for perhaps the first time in the whole account, to someone other than himself. He has 5 brothers still alive back home, living the same comfortable, oblivious life he used to live, and he does not want them to end up where he is. So he makes one last request. Send Lazarus back to warn them. Give them a heads up. Let a dead man show up on their doorstep and scare them straight before it is too late. It is, honestly, the most sympathetic thing he does in the entire story, and the answer he gets is one of the most quietly profound lines in the whole passage. Abraham tells him that his brothers already have Moses and the prophets, meaning they already have the scriptures, the warnings, the whole message spelled out in writing, freely available and largely ignored. If they will not listen to that, Abraham says, they will not be convinced even if someone rises from the dead. Read that again with the knowledge of who is telling the story, and it lands like a thunderclap. The point is blunt. People who have decided not to believe will find a reason to dismiss even a resurrection. Some folks, it turns out, will not listen no matter how dramatic the messenger, which is a piece of commentary on human stubbornness that has aged remarkably, almost uncomfortably, well. Think about how counterintuitive that claim actually is. Surely, we tell ourselves, if a dead man showed up glowing at the dinner table, everyone would immediately reform. Surely a real miracle would settle the matter once and for all. But the story insists otherwise, and human experience keeps quietly backing it up. People are experts at explaining away exactly the evidence they have already decided not to want. Show them something impossible, and they will call it a trick, a hallucination, bad lighting, indigestion, anything at all except a reason to change their minds. The rich man wanted a spectacular sign sent to his brothers, and Abraham essentially answers that the problem was never a shortage of information. The brothers had the whole message already, sitting right there on the shelf gathering dust. Their problem, like their brothers, was never that they did not know, it was that they did not want to. Now, in the interest of being straight with you, there is a long-standing conversation among scholars and theologians about how literally to read this whole account. Some treat it as a parable, a teaching story crafted to make a point, since Jesus told a great many parables and this one carries that flavour. Others read it as a genuine glimpse behind the veil, a real report of a real place, partly because Jesus names Lazarus specifically, which he does not usually do in his invented illustrations. It is a fair debate, and reasonable people land on both sides of it. But here is what makes the debate almost beside the point for our purposes. Either way, whether Jesus is describing an actual event or painting a vivid picture to teach a lesson, he is deliberately sketching the layout of Sheol using its two compartments, its chasm, its conscious inhabitants, and its escorting angels. He chose those details on purpose. Whether the frame is a documentary or a portrait, the subject he is showing us is the same architecture we mapped a moment ago, now lit up from the inside and given a human face. That is a remarkably generous move on his part when you think about it. He could have left the afterlife as a rumour, a vague warning, a shape in the fog. Instead, he hands us a scene we can actually stand inside, with named people and specific geography, and a conversation we can follow line by line. He turns doctrine into a place you can visit in your imagination, which is exactly why this one short story has done more to shape how ordinary people picture the world beyond death than entire libraries of careful argument ever have. And that is precisely why this story matters so much on our journey. The dry diagram of Sheol, two compartments, one chasm sorted by faith, temporary until judgment, suddenly has a beating heart. We can see it. We can feel the heat on one side and the rest on the other. We can watch the reversal play out and understand, in a way no whiteboard ever manages, that the accounts we settle in this life have a way of following us into the next. The beggar at the gate and the man in the purple robes both ended up in Sheol, just as everyone did in that era, but they woke up on opposite sides of that fixed and famous chasm, and there was no drop of water, and no crossing, and no undo button. Which leaves us standing at the edge of a much bigger question. If this was the arrangement for the entire ancient world, if every soul funneled into this one divided waiting room, then something enormous must have had to happen to change it. Something big enough to empty out that good compartment entirely and reroute the whole map. And that something is where our story turns next. Now, that world-changing event is coming, and it will be worth the wait, but a rescue only makes sense once you understand the territory it happened in and the forces that made a rescue necessary in the first place. So before we follow anyone down into the depths to empty out that peaceful compartment, we need to pull the camera all the way back to a location we have been standing on this entire time without giving it a second thought. Our own planet. Because here is something the map has quietly been keeping from us. Earth is not a neutral parking lot sitting just outside the spiritual world, a lobby where nothing supernatural happens until the day you finally die. Earth is already on the map. It is already contested ground, and you have been living on top of one of its more active regions your entire life, most likely while assuming the interesting stuff only switches on after the funeral. It does not. The interesting stuff is happening in the room with you right now, which is either thrilling or deeply unsettling depending on your mood. We tend to think of the planet as belonging to us, the humans, with maybe a few animals and some very stubborn houseplants along for the ride. The Bible works from a considerably more crowded guest list. According to Scripture, we are sharing this rock with at least 2 other populations of beings, and the only reason you do not bump into them in line at the grocery store is that they are, inconveniently for our peace of mind, invisible. They do not show up on any camera, they do not register on any instrument, and they have been here far longer than we have. 2 groups, in particular, matter enormously for the rest of our journey, and they could not be more opposed to one another. The first group is the one everybody has heard of and almost nobody understands correctly: demons. Now forget the cartoon image for a second. The little red creatures with pitchforks and pointy tails sitting on someone's shoulder giving bad advice. The Bible describes demons as fallen angels, spirits that once belonged to the heavenly side of things and then, at some early point in the story, were thrown down and cast out. They lost their original position, their original home, and their original job, and ever since they have been drifting through the world with an enormous grudge and nowhere in particular to be. Picture a workforce that was fired from the best employer in existence, escorted out of the building, and then told they could never come back, and you begin to get the emotional temperature of the thing. They are not neutral. They are not curious observers. They are, to put it mildly, not fans of the management that let them go, and they take that resentment out on the one creation that management seems especially fond of, which happens to be us. It is worth being honest that the Bible is remarkably sparing about how exactly this defection happened. It does not hand us a detailed police report of the original rebellion, a full transcript of who said what before the fall. What it gives us instead are scattered glimpses, a picture of pride overreaching itself, of created beings who decided they wanted a higher position than the one they were given and made a grab for it. The broad shape is a mutiny, a portion of the heavenly staff refusing their assigned roles and being expelled for it, and their leader carrying the rest down with him. Beyond that outline, a lot of the specifics live in the realm of educated inference rather than plain statement, and any honest guide has to admit that. What is not vague, though, is the result. Whatever the exact mechanics of the fall, the world ended up sharing its airspace with a population of embittered exiles, and that population has been in the deception business ever since. The second group is the exact opposite, and while the demons get all the movie deals, these are the ones actually running most of the errands, the holy angels. And here is where our modern imagination has unfortunately done these beings a real disservice. When people hear the word angel now, they tend to picture a chubby infant with tiny wings and a bow, or a soft glowing figure in a nightgown handing out warm feelings. The biblical version is a good deal more serious and a good deal more useful. Angels in Scripture are ministering spirits. Think of them less as decorative and more as functional, a working staff of messengers and agents that God dispatches on specific assignments. They carry news, they deliver warnings, they escort people, as we already watched happen when a certain beggar got an honor guard he never received in life. They show up, do the job they were sent to do, and leave. They are in effect the cosmic delivery service, and unlike the human version, their packages always arrive and they never leave them at the wrong door. And their assignments, when you actually catalogue them, run an impressively wide range. Sometimes an angel appears to announce a birth before it happens. Sometimes one turns up to warn a family to flee before disaster arrives. Sometimes the mission is protection, standing guard over a person or a place, and sometimes, less comfortably, the mission is confrontation, because Scripture is not shy about depicting angels in outright combat with the other side. There is even a hierarchy on the good team, ranks and roles and standouts. One in particular, named Michael, gets described as a chief prince and shows up whenever the heavy lifting is required, functioning as something like the field commander of the loyal forces. So the picture is not a swarm of interchangeable glowing figures. It is an organized operation with couriers, guardians, announcers, and soldiers, each dispatched for a purpose, which is a far cry from the greeting card version most of us grew up with. One more thing about the loyal side is worth flagging, because it corrects a temptation people have fallen into for a very long time. Angels, for all their power and their impressive resume, are not meant to be worshipped, and the striking thing is that in Scripture they refuse it themselves. On the occasions when an overwhelmed human drops to the ground to honour one of them, the angel's response is essentially to tell the person to get back up and stop, to direct that worship toward God instead, because the angel is a fellow servant and nothing more. That is a small detail with a large implication. These beings, however dazzling, are staff, not management. They run errands for the one in charge, and they are careful never to be mistaken for him, which is precisely the kind of humility the fallen side conspicuously lost somewhere along the way. So far, this sounds like a fairly clean setup. Good team over here, bad team over there, both invisible, both busy, but the moment you look closer at how the bad team actually operates, you run straight into the single most surprising rule in this entire chapter, the one that quietly overturns everything horror movies have taught us. Demons serve Satan, yes. They are on his side, they follow his agenda, they want what he wants. But they do not get to do whatever they please. Astonishingly, they act only with God's permission. The dark side is not running loose across the earth like an unsupervised toddler in a candy store. It operates on a leash, and the leash is held from above. The clearest window into this arrangement comes from the book of Job, and the opening scene there is one of the strangest and most revealing in the whole Bible. It shows a kind of heavenly assembly, a gathering where the various spirits present themselves before God, and Satan himself strolls in among them, apparently still allowed at the meetings despite everything. God points out a particular man named Job, a genuinely good and faithful person, almost like a proud parent bragging about a favourite. And Satan responds with a sneer that is, honestly, a pretty sophisticated bit of cynicism. He argues that Job is only faithful because his life is easy. He points out that God has put a hedge around the man, a protective fence surrounding him, his household, and everything he owns. Take away the hedge, Satan says, strip away the comfort and the protection, and this so-called faithful man will drop the act and curse you to your face. And here is the crucial part. Satan cannot simply do it. He has to ask. He has to get sign-off. The whole confrontation makes it unmistakably clear that the accuser could not touch a single thing in Job's life without explicit permission. And even when that permission is granted, it comes with firm limits attached, boundaries he is not allowed to cross. This is not a villain with unlimited power. This is a villain who has to file a request and wait for approval, which is a far cry from the all-powerful terror we usually imagine. The security fence around a human being turns out to be real, and the one who wants to tear it down needs a signature first and does not always get one. Whatever you thought the balance of power looked like, it is a good deal more one-sided than the campfire stories suggest. That detail deserves a moment longer, because it carries a weight that goes well past a single ancient story. If even the leader of the fallen has to ask before he acts, then evil, for all its noise and menace, is not actually a rival superpower locked in an even match against the good. It is a subordinate force operating inside boundaries it did not set and cannot expand on its own. That reframes the whole battlefield. The war is real, and the harm is real, but the two sides are not equals trading blows across a level field. One side is sovereign and the other side needs permission slips. For anyone who has ever lain awake imagining the darkness as an unstoppable tide, that is a quietly enormous relief, and it is one of those biblical details that sounds like a footnote until you realize it changes the entire mood of the story. Of course, that raises the obvious follow-up, the one a child asks and most adults quietly wonder. If the good side is genuinely sovereign and the bad side needs permission for everything, then why not simply pull the plug on the whole rebellion at once? Why leave the exiles roaming at all? Here, honesty requires admitting the Bible does not hand over a tidy, complete answer, and any guide who pretends otherwise is selling something. What the text offers is more of a direction than a full explanation. It hints at patience, at a story still unfolding, at a plan that treats the freedom to respond as something worth preserving, even at a steep cost, and at a final resolution that has been scheduled rather than skipped. In other words, the loose ends are not loose because nobody's in control. They are loose because the story is not over, and the ending, as we will eventually see, has already been written down. You see the very same rule play out again in one of the encounters in the Gospel of Luke, where Jesus comes across a man who has been overtaken by a whole crowd of these fallen spirits. What is telling is not the spectacle of it, but the behaviour of the demons themselves. They recognise exactly who Jesus is the instant they see him, which is more than most of the humans in the story manage, and rather than attacking, they beg. They plead not to be tormented, and specifically they plead not to be sent away into a certain deep place, a prison we will be visiting in full a little further down the map, so we will leave that door closed for now. But notice the posture. The dark side, face to face with real authority, does not swagger. It negotiates. It asks for terms. It requests of all things permission to go somewhere else instead. That is not the conduct of a force that owns the earth. That is the conduct of a force that knows exactly where it stands in the chain of command, and it is not at the top. There is a strange and almost tragic footnote buried in that behaviour. These spirits are not confused about who Jesus is. They are not skeptics waiting to be convinced. They know precisely what they are looking at, and they react with dread rather than doubt. In a sense, they have sharper theology than most of the humans standing nearby, and it does them no good whatsoever. Knowing the truth and being changed by it, it turns out, are two entirely different things, and the fallen side is the permanent proof of the gap. They hold the information and reject the relationship, which may be the loneliest position anywhere in the universe. Now, this whole invisible population is not just wandering around at random either. There is structure to it, an organization chart, and it is more territorial than you would expect. Both sides, the fallen and the holy, seem to operate through assignments. Certain spirits get placed over certain things, sometimes a single person, sometimes a community, sometimes an entire nation. The Bible has a specific word for the ones handed this kind of regional authority. It calls them princes. And before you picture anything royal, think of it more like a management structure, a spiritual chain of oversight where different beings are responsible for different territories, the way a company might assign a regional manager to a particular district. The book of Daniel gives us the eeriest example of this, and it is worth sitting with because it reframes how a lot of things actually work behind the scenes. Daniel prays, asking for understanding, and an angel is dispatched to bring him the answer. Simple enough, except the messenger arrives 3 full weeks late and immediately explains why. He was held up. Specifically, he tells Daniel that the prince of Persia stood against him and blocked his path for 21 days, and that he only broke through because Michael, that same chief prince we just met, came to back him up. Read that again slowly, because it is genuinely strange. A message from heaven got delayed for 3 weeks by an invisible territorial conflict happening in the spiritual layer over an ancient empire. The celestial mail, in other words, got stuck in a jurisdictional dispute at the border and needed reinforcements to clear customs. It is a small, almost offhand detail in the text, but it pulls back the curtain on an entire hidden struggle happening on top of and underneath the human events we can actually see. Sit with what that implies for a second, because it quietly rearranges how you might read all of history. If empires and nations have spiritual princes attached to them, contending in a layer we cannot see, then the wars and rivalries and rises and falls we read about in textbooks are only the visible half of the story. Underneath the treaties and the battles there is a second contest running, older and stranger, that never appears in any account of events. This is not an invitation to start blaming invisible beings for every headline, and the Bible does not encourage that kind of paranoid bookkeeping. But it does insist that the human stage is not the only stage, that there is more going on behind the curtain of ordinary events than the actors on the front of it ever suspect. It makes the world feel larger and more layered than the flat version we usually settle for, which is either wondrous or exhausting depending on how much you like surprises. And it is only fair to point out that the territorial contest runs both ways. If there are hostile princes contending over regions and peoples, there are also loyal ones, powerful figures on the good side assigned and dispatched into the very same struggle, which is exactly why that delayed messenger eventually broke through at all. The picture is not one of a lonely humanity abandoned to face an organized darkness by itself. It is a picture of a contested field with real forces on both sides, and of a chain of command on the loyal side that is, in the end, the one holding the authority. That does not make the struggle any less serious, or the stakes any lower, but it does mean the field is never quite as lopsided against us as it can feel from down here at ground level, where we only ever see the visible half of what is actually going on. Which brings us finally to the top of the fallen chain of command, because if there are princes over people and princes over nations, there is one who rose higher than all of them and claimed the biggest territory available. One of the fallen did not settle for a district or a kingdom, he went for the whole planet. The Bible gives him a string of unnerving titles that make the scope of his ambition clear. It calls him the prince of this world. It calls him the god of this age, the one who blinds the minds of people so they cannot see the truth clearly. These are not small labels. They describe a being who managed to get himself installed, at least for a time, as the ruling power over the entire human sphere, which is a promotion absolutely nobody should envy, but which explains a great deal about the general state of things down here. And notice the specific job description hidden in that second title, because it tells you exactly how he actually operates. He is described as the one who blinds minds, which means his primary weapon is not a pitchfork and it is not brute force, it is deception. He works by getting people to see the world slightly wrong, to miss things, to look straight past the truth without registering it, the way the rich man in our earlier story looked straight past a suffering human being every single day. That is a far more effective strategy than any horror movie assault, and a far quieter one. A monster kicking down the door at least announces itself. A quiet nudge that convinces you there is nothing to see and no door at all is much harder to resist, precisely because you never notice it happening. The cartoon version of the enemy is loud and obvious and easy to spot. The biblical version is subtle, patient, and mostly invisible, which is exactly why he has been so effective for so long. And this is not some new, separate villain we're meeting for the first time. This is the original one, the very first defector, the being who showed up at the beginning of the human story and talked the first people into ruining everything, appearing back then in the form of a serpent. Elsewhere, the Bible escalates the imagery and calls him a great dragon, which is a considerable upgrade from a talking snake, and gives you a sense of how his profile grows across the story. We are going to return to that opening act of sabotage in the very next stretch of our journey, when we visit the first version of Paradise and see exactly what he cost the human race, so we will not unwrap the whole scene here. For now it is enough to know that the being at the top of the fallen hierarchy and the being who first pulled humanity into the mess are one and the same, and that he has been treating this planet as his personal territory ever since. One last thing before we leave the battlefield, because it sets up a location we will explore in detail soon. These fallen spirits can attach themselves to people, and even to places. They can move in, take hold, cause real trouble, but, and this matters, they are not permanently welded to whatever they inhabit. They can be removed, they can be driven out, they can be relocated, and crucially, not all of them are even free to roam in the first place. A portion of them have already been locked away in that separate deep prison we keep brushing up against, sealed off from the rest, which raises the obvious question of why some get to wander loose while others are chained in the dark. Hold that question. It has a genuinely disturbing answer, and it is coming. It is also worth heading off a misunderstanding before it takes root, because talk of unseen spirits and possession has a way of tipping people into either flat dismissiveness or full-blown paranoia, and neither is where the Bible actually lands. Scripture does not present a world where every bad mood is a demon and every creaking floorboard is a haunting. Most of the fallen side's work, as we noted, is quiet influence rather than dramatic takeover. The gentle nudge and the convenient blind spot far more often than anything cinematic, and the constant refrain running underneath all of it is that the whole arrangement sits under authority, which is precisely why the appropriate response is not fear. A soldier who knows the war is already decided fights very differently from one who thinks the outcome is still up for grabs. The unseen conflict is real, but it is not a reason to jump at every shadow, and the text goes out of its way to keep readers from doing exactly that. The takeaway from all of this is simple and a little bracing. The spiritual war is not a distant abstraction happening in some far-off realm you will only encounter after death. It is not a legend safely locked in an old book. It is happening here, on the ground you're standing on, in the ordinary air around you, overlaid invisibly on top of your completely normal Tuesday. You've been living inside a contested territory this whole time, sharing your planet with an unseen population of couriers and exiles and mostly not noticing a thing, which when you think about it is arguably the most unsettling detail of all. Now before we push forward and start visiting the remaining realms on the map, we have to do something slightly less dramatic but genuinely necessary. We have to clean the map. Because over the centuries, a handful of very popular ideas about the afterlife have gotten mixed in with the biblical picture until most people cannot tell which parts came from scripture and which parts came from somewhere else entirely. 3 of these in particular tend to get stapled onto the Bible so firmly that people are shocked to learn they were never actually printed on it. So we're going to gently peel off 3 foreign stickers, one at a time, and the goal here is not to sneer at anyone or declare a winner in some ancient argument. The goal is simply to draw a clear line between what the text says and what tradition, imagination, and a few philosophy borrowings added on top. With those 3 smudges wiped away, the real map underneath gets a lot easier to read. It helps to understand up front that none of these ideas arrived out of nowhere or attached themselves for no reason. Each one filled a genuine human need, which is exactly why each one stuck so stubbornly. One of them answered the worry that we're not quite clean enough to face perfection at the moment we die. Another answered the fear of being consciously aware through an unimaginably long wait. And the third answered the ache for a second chance, the wish that a single flawed life is not the whole story. Every one of these ideas is, at its root, an attempt to soothe a real anxiety, which is precisely why simply mocking them misses the point entirely. The better move is to look at what each one is trying to solve, and then check whether the biblical text actually solves it the same way. Often it does not, and often it offers something else instead. The first idea is purgatory, and it is worth explaining fairly because it is a serious belief held by an enormous number of thoughtful people, not a cartoon. In the Catholic tradition, purgatory is understood as a temporary state, a place or process of purification that a soul passes through on the way to heaven. The reasoning behind it is actually rather tender, if you follow the logic. It assumes that a person can die genuinely destined for heaven, yet still carry the residue of earthly imperfection, still need a kind of final cleaning before entering a perfectly holy presence. So purgatory becomes the spiritual equivalent of wiping your feet and washing up before you walk into a spotless house, a period of purifying discomfort that finishes the job. It is not a punishment in the sense of a permanent sentence. It is more like a cleaning cycle, an unpleasant but ultimately hopeful stop where the destination is never in doubt, only the timing. Around this belief grew a whole set of practices that, for centuries, shaped how ordinary people related to their dead. Prayers were offered on behalf of departed loved ones, special services were held for them, all in the hope of easing or shortening that purifying stage. There is something genuinely moving in that, the image of the living continuing to care for the dead, refusing to simply let them go, doing what little they believed they could to help a soul along its way. Whatever one concludes about the doctrine itself, the impulse behind those practices was love, and it is only fair to say so plainly before poking at the theology. The reason many Protestants set purgatory aside comes down to two objections, and they are worth understanding rather than just noting. The first is a question of sources. A good chunk of the scriptural support for the idea leans on a book called 2 Maccabees, which describes offerings made on behalf of the dead. The catch is that Protestant Bibles do not consider 2 Maccabees part of the canon in the first place. So from that side of the aisle, building a doctrine on it is like citing a chapter that was never in your edition of the book. The second objection is more direct, and it comes from a single sharp line in the letter to the Hebrews, which states that people are appointed to die once, and after that comes judgment. Once to die, then judgment. No intermediate cleaning cycle mentioned, no third stop penciled in between the two. Underneath that verse sits a deeper disagreement about how a person gets made fit for heaven in the first place, whether it is a process the soul must complete, or a gift already finished on their behalf. And that quiet difference is really what the whole debate turns on. Both sides, it should be said, are reading carefully and reasoning in good faith. They are just working from different bookshelves and weighing different verses, which is how a lot of these long-running disagreements actually work when you look closely. The second idea we need to peel off is one you may have absorbed without ever hearing its name, and it goes by the label soul sleep. This is the belief that when a person dies they do not go anywhere conscious at all. Instead they fall into a kind of deep, dreamless unconsciousness, switched off entirely, and stay that way until the future resurrection wakes everyone up at once. On this view, there is no waiting room experience, no awareness in the meantime, nothing at all between your last breath and the final morning. You simply close your eyes and, from your perspective, open them again instantly at the end of history, having slept through the entire wait like the world's longest and most efficient nap. It is honestly a strangely comforting idea if the alternative frightens you, the ultimate lie-in with no alarm clock ever going off. A handful of Christian groups hold to it sincerely to this day, so it is not some fringe curiosity from a dusty corner of history. And here is where I have to be completely straight with you, because this is not a case of the Bible clearly saying one thing and folklore saying another. This is a genuine disagreement among sincere Christians who will take Scripture seriously, and it hinges on how you read certain images. The soul sleep camp has a real textual foothold. The Bible repeatedly describes death using the language of sleep, speaking of people who have fallen asleep rather than simply died. If the text keeps calling death a sleep, they argue, maybe it means exactly that, a genuine period of unconsciousness. The other side counters on two fronts. First, they point to the passages we have already leaned on, the ones where being absent from the body means being immediately present with the Lord, along with a striking promise Jesus makes to a dying man that the two of them would be together that very day, not at some far-off future point. And second, they argue that the sleep language was only ever a gentle figure of speech for the body, which really does lie still and quiet in the ground, and was never meant to describe the conscious self at all. We touched on that immediate transition idea earlier, so we will not re-argue the whole thing here, but this is the chapter where you can see it becomes a real fork in the road rather than a settled fact. Reasonable, faithful people genuinely land on both sides of whether the dead are aware or asleep, and anyone who tells you it is obvious is skipping over a debate that has run for centuries. And there is something healthy in simply being able to say that out loud. Not every question about the world beyond has a single, settled, obvious answer that all serious readers agree on, and pretending otherwise does nobody any favours. Some features of the map are drawn in bold, permanent ink, and some are sketched in pencil that faithful people have been redrawing and debating for a very long time. Being honest about which is not a weakness in the picture. It is what makes the bold parts worth trusting, because you can see they are not simply being asserted with the same easy confidence as everything else. The third idea is the one that has drifted furthest from the biblical page, and it is reincarnation, the belief that the soul does not head to a single destination after death, but instead cycles back around into a new body, and then another, and another, life after life, working off some balance sheet across countless returns. It is an ancient and widespread idea with deep roots in the traditions of the East, and over the last century or so it has drifted steadily westward and settled comfortably into a lot of casual modern spirituality. Part of its appeal is obvious. It promises a kind of cosmic fairness, the sense that every wrong eventually gets balanced across the long arc of many lives, and it offers the deeply attractive notion that we get more than one attempt, that the story loops rather than ends, that if you fumble this life you can simply respawn and try again with a fresh character. It is essentially the belief that existence comes with unlimited continues, and it is easy to see why a person would want that to be true. Underneath the appeal, though, sits a very different engine than the one the Bible runs on, and the contrast is worth naming out loud. A system of many lives is essentially a system of self-correction, where you climb or slip based on your own accumulated ledger across the ages, balancing your own books over an immense stretch of time. The biblical picture runs on something almost opposite, less a matter of endlessly working off your own account, and more a matter of what is done on your behalf within a single lifetime. That is not a small tuning difference between two similar machines. It is two entirely different views of how a person gets set right, and choosing between them shapes everything downstream, which is exactly why the text is so firm about the one death and the single reckoning. The trouble, from a biblical standpoint, is that the text points in the exact opposite direction from that endless loop, and it does so using the very same line we already met when we were dealing with purgatory. That sharp sentence in Hebrews does double duty here. People are appointed to die once, and after that comes judgment. Once, not repeatedly, not on a loop, not with a queue of future lives waiting to be assigned. One death, followed by an accounting, and then the story moves forward rather than resetting. There is no rebirth cycle written anywhere into that structure, no cosmic recycling program returning souls to the factory floor for another run, and it is worth noticing that the Bible does have its own answer to the longing reincarnation is chasing, the wish that the body is not simply lost forever. That answer is not a series of borrowed new bodies, but something else entirely, something we will reach further along the map, and it is far stranger and far more permanent than a revolving door of lives. For now, simply hold the contrast. One pass through, not many. And what you do with the single pass genuinely sticks. It is worth pausing to notice what this whole cleanup actually accomplishes, because peeling off wrong ideas is not just a negative exercise. Each sticker we removed was covering up something the Bible does say, and clearing them lets that real thing show through. Take off the cleaning cycle, and you are left with the stark, serious weight of a single life that counts. Take off the guaranteed unconsciousness, and you're left with the possibility, argued over but genuinely present in the text, that the self stays awake and goes somewhere the moment the body stops. Take off the endless loop of new lives, and you are left with a story that actually moves toward a destination rather than circling forever. The point of clearing the map was never to leave it blank. It was to let the real features underneath finally become visible, and they turn out to be more definite and more consequential than the comfortable blur we scraped off the top. So with those 3 stickers peeled off, no cleaning cycle penciled in between death and judgment, no guaranteed unconsciousness in the meantime that the whole church agrees on, and no revolving door of new lives, the map in front of us is a good deal clearer and a good deal more honest. We have cleared away the additions and the borrowed ideas, and what remains is the actual structure the Bible lays out, unobstructed. And that structure is about to get more beautiful and more surprising than anything we have looked at so far, because the next region on our journey is one that most people are absolutely certain they understand, and most people are absolutely wrong about. It exists in more forms than one, its history runs from the very first pages of Scripture to the very last, and it all begins in a garden that humanity managed to lose. So let's step into that garden, because this is where most people's tidy picture of the afterlife quietly falls apart. Ask the average person what paradise is, and they will describe a single place, a fixed destination, clouds and gates, and maybe a harp or 2. The Bible has a considerably more surprising arrangement in mind. Paradise, in Scripture, is not one location at all. It shows up in 3 distinct forms across the sweep of the story, 3 different versions separated by enormous stretches of history, and if you do not know that, you end up jamming 3 separate things into one word and wondering why none of it lines up. We're going to meet all 3 before this journey ends, but they arrive in order, and the first one is the oldest, the most famous, and the one humanity managed to lose almost immediately. It is the garden. Now, when people hear the Garden of Eden, they usually picture a very nice park, some fruit trees, a pleasant climate, a couple of unbothered residents wandering around without much of a dress code, and while that is not exactly wrong, it badly undersells what made the place remarkable. Eden was not special because the landscaping was good. Eden was special because of what it was, geographically speaking, on the spiritual map. It was the one location where 2 entire dimensions overlapped. The physical world and the spiritual world, the realm of dirt and the realm of God, were not fused into one thing, but they were not fully separated either. They touched. Eden sat right on the seam between them, the single point where the 2 overlapped closely enough that you could stand in one and reach into the other. There is a small linguistic detail here that is quietly delightful once you know it. The very word paradise traces back to an old term that simply meant an enclosed garden or a walled park, the sort of lush, cultivated green space an ancient king might keep for his own pleasure. So when the Bible later reaches for the word paradise to describe the good places souls go, it is not pulling a vague, cloudy abstraction out of the air. It is reaching straight back to this garden, to Eden, to a real cultivated place with real growing things in it. Every later paradise, in a sense, gets described using the vocabulary of that first one, which means the garden is not merely an opening scene that got lost. It is the template, the original of which every good place afterward is a version, the reason paradise has always been imagined as a garden rather than, say, an office or a very nice cloud. The whole idea has roots, quite literally, in a patch of ground where 2 worlds once touched. The clearest sign of this overlap is a detail in the text that is so casual, it is easy to skim right past. Scripture describes God walking in the garden in the cool of the day, moving through the place the way a person might stroll through their own backyard in the evening. Sit with how astonishing that is for a moment. This is not God appearing in a blinding vision or thundering from a mountaintop with the whole scene shaking. This is God simply present, on foot, at a comfortable hour, close enough that the sound of him walking could be heard. That is not how the divine and the human relate anywhere else in the story. It is a level of nearness so casual it almost sounds domestic, like a neighbour wandering over to chat across the fence. And that easy closeness was possible precisely because of where the garden sat, on the overlap, where the distance between the 2 realms shrank down to nothing. It helps to think of it like 2 rooms that share an open doorway. In most of history, as we have already seen, the spiritual and the physical are firmly walled off from each other, separate spaces with a locked door between them, which is exactly why the unseen population from the last stretch of our journey stays unseen. But in Eden, the door stood wide open. You could walk from one room into the other without ceremony. The 2 spaces breathed the same air. This was not heaven, and it was not merely earth. It was the overlap, the intersection, the one address in the whole story, where both worlds were fully in contact, and where a human being could keep company with God the way you would keep company with anyone, which is a privilege that has never quite been available since. It is worth slowing down here, because this idea of the overlap is not just a nice piece of trivia about one garden. It is the master key to the entire rest of our journey, the single concept the whole story of paradise turns on. Think of the seam between the two realms as something that can stand wide open, cracked slightly, or sealed completely, like a door hinged at different angles at different points in the story. In Eden it stood wide open. Very soon it will be shut hard. And the three forms of paradise we keep mentioning are really three different states of that same seam, three different settings of that one door, each telling you exactly how close the two worlds are allowed to get at that moment in history. Once you start seeing paradise this way, as a question of how far the door is open rather than as a fixed spot on a map, the whole arc clicks into place. We are, in a very real sense, going to spend the rest of this journey watching a single door move, and at the centre of this overlapping garden stood the feature that mattered most for everything that follows, the tree of life. This was not decorative shrubbery. According to the text, its fruit carried something extraordinary, a sustaining power that kept death itself at bay. To eat from it was to go on living, indefinitely, without the shutdown that eventually catches up with every other living thing. In effect, humanity had access to a source of ongoing life with no expiration date built in, an arrangement so good it would be almost impossible to appreciate from where we sit now, on the other side of the fence, quietly aging. This tree is worth committing to memory because it is going to matter enormously later. It is in fact the single thread that ties all three forms of paradise together across the entire span of Scripture. Wherever the tree of life shows up, you know you are looking at paradise in one of its versions. Consider it the identifying mark, the recurring signature, and file it away, because we will not see the full point of it until the very end. It is worth being clear about what that kind of life actually was, because immortality is one of those words we toss around without really feeling the weight of it. This was not merely a very long lifespan, the biblical equivalent of good genes and a sensible diet. It was ongoing life sustained from outside, a continual topping up that meant the shutdown every other creature faces simply never had to arrive. Humanity, in other words, was not originally built to die. Death was not part of the initial design, not a natural feature of being human, but something that entered later, through the door we're about to watch get kicked open. Hold on to that, because it quietly reframes death entirely. In the biblical picture, death is not the way things were always meant to be. It is an intruder, a malfunction, a consequence that showed up uninvited, which is a very different thing from an inevitability, and it explains why the rest of the story treats death not as a friend to be gently accepted, but as an enemy to be defeated. Which brings us to the part of the story everyone knows and almost nobody enjoys, the moment it all went wrong. We already met the being responsible back on the battlefield, the original defector wearing the shape of a serpent, so we do not need to reintroduce him. But this is where he does the damage that earns him the rest of his reputation. His method, notably, was not force. He did not storm the garden or break anything down. He talked. He made a pitch. He approached the first humans with a suggestion dressed up as wisdom, a proposal that the boundary God had set was not for their protection but for their limitation, that stepping over the one line they had been asked not to cross would make them more, not less. It was, in the plainest terms, a sales pitch, and a dishonest one, the kind that sounds generous while quietly working against you, and unfortunately it landed. The humans took the deal. What makes the whole episode so unsettling is how quiet and reasonable the ruin sounded in the moment. There was no cackling villainy, no obvious menace, nothing that would trip any alarm. The pitch worked precisely because it flattered rather than threatened. It did not say obey me, it said you deserve more. It suggested that the single boundary in an otherwise limitless paradise was evidence of someone holding out on them, keeping them small on purpose, and that is a devastatingly effective angle, because it turns a gift into a grievance. The humans had been handed an entire world and asked to avoid one single thing, and the pitch reframed that lone restriction as the only thing that really mattered, the proof that they were being cheated. Underneath the question of a piece of fruit sat a much larger question. the only one that ever really counts in this story. Would they trust that the boundary was for their good, or would they trust the voice suggesting it was for their harm? It was never fundamentally about eating. It was about whom to believe, and they believed the wrong voice, which is a mistake with a long and depressingly familiar career in human history. It is worth pausing on just how bad a deal it turned out to be, because the fine print was catastrophic. What was advertised as an upgrade was in reality a demolition. The moment the line was crossed, the whole arrangement that made Eden what it was began to collapse. The easy nearness between the two realms curdled into distance. Where there had been open access, there was now a fracture. And the consequence was not some abstract spiritual demerit filed away in a cosmic ledger. It was concrete, and it was immediate, and it went straight to the heart of the garden itself, to that tree standing at the centre with its endless supply of life. Because now there was a serious problem. Human beings had become broken, fractured versions of what they were meant to be, and the very last thing you would want is for a broken, fractured creature to lock in that condition forever by continuing to eat from a tree that never lets anything end. Immortality, which had been a gift in a good state, would have become a trap in a ruined one. So the access was cut, and the way the Bible describes the cutting is one of its most vivid and slightly terrifying images. God stationed guardians at the entrance to the garden, powerful beings called cherubim, and along with them a flaming sword that turned in every direction, sealing off the path to the tree of life. Picture the most intimidating security detail imaginable, posted permanently at a door you're no longer allowed through, and equipped with a weapon that removes any temptation to argue the point. This was the eviction, plainly stated. Humanity was put outside, the way back was blocked, and the blockage was not a suggestion. There would be no sneaking around to the back entrance, no waiting for the guards to take a break. The door to the overlap was shut, and it was shut hard, and it has stayed shut ever since. And here is a detail that flips the whole grim scene on its head, once you catch it. The ceiling of the garden reads at first like pure punishment, a door slammed in anger. But look again at the reasoning the text quietly builds in. The danger was that a now broken humanity might reach the tree and lock its brokenness in place permanently, becoming forever what it had just become, deathless in exactly the wrong condition. Imagine a wound that could never heal because the body could never move past the moment of injury, the pain frozen and made eternal. Sealing the tree prevented precisely that. It closed off the possibility of an unending existence in a ruined state. Read that way. The flaming sword at the gate is not only a punishment, it is also, strangely, a mercy, a hard kindness that keeps a temporary catastrophe from becoming a permanent one. The eviction bought time, and time is exactly what the rest of the rescue would need. Sometimes the locked door is the gentlest thing available, even when it does not feel remotely like it from the wrong side of it. And this is the piece that reaches all the way down to your own life, right now, today. The separation that happened at that garden gate never got undone. From that moment on, the physical and spiritual worlds, which had once touched so closely that God could walk among people at a comfortable hour, were pulled apart into the two firmly walled-off rooms we live with to this day. That locked door is the reason the spiritual realm feels so distant to us, the reason the unseen stays unseen, the reason the divine no longer strolls through anyone's backyard in the cool of the evening. We are, all of us, living on the wrong side of that gate, in a world where the overlap has closed, and most people have simply never known anything else, and assume the separation is just how reality has always been. It is not. It is the aftermath of a door being shut a very long time ago. Step back from the wreckage for a moment and notice what Eden actually tells us about how things were meant to be in the first place, because that is easy to lose in the drama of the fall. The original design was not distance. It was not a god tucked away in some remote heaven, occasionally reachable through enormous effort and the right rituals. The original design was nearness, easy company, two realms in constant contact and a creator content to walk among people at a pleasant hour. Everything that came afterward, all the separation and searching and reaching upward, is a departure from that starting point, not the baseline, which may go some way toward explaining a certain restlessness that seems built into people, a nagging sense that the world as we find it is somehow not quite the way it is supposed to be, that something we cannot quite name has gone missing. According to this story, that instinct is not a malfunction. It is a memory. It is the faint echo of a door that used to stand open, and the whole long arc that follows is the slow, patient work of getting it open again. So the first form of paradise was lost. Not misplaced, not temporarily closed for renovations, but genuinely lost to the human race, sealed behind guardians and a turning blade, its tree of life placed permanently out of reach. That is a genuinely bleak place to leave things, and if the story stopped there, it would be one of the great tragedies of all literature, a paradise opened and then slammed shut in almost the same breath. But the story does not stop there, and here is the quiet promise buried in this chapter that makes everything that follows possible. The tree of life was blocked. It was not destroyed. It disappears from view, but it does not disappear from the story, and the whole rest of the journey is, in a sense, the long tale of how a shut door slowly, deliberately gets reopened. We will not see how that finishes until the very end of everything, but keep that tree in the back of your mind because it is coming back, and where it reappears will tell you exactly how far the rescue has progressed. For now, though, the situation is grim. The overlap is closed, the garden is sealed, and every human being who dies is funneling into that divided waiting room we mapped earlier. The good ones resting on one side of the great chasm, waiting for something none of them can quite see yet. They are waiting, though they may not know it, for a rescue. And the rescue, when it finally comes, arrives from the single most unexpected direction imaginable, on a day that history has almost entirely forgotten to notice. Here is one of the strangest facts about the most famous weekend in the world. Nearly everyone knows the two ends of it. On one end, a death, a public execution, the darkest afternoon in the story. On the other end, an empty tomb, the morning that changed everything, celebrated by more people than any other event in human history. But squeezed between those two bookends is a full day that almost nobody ever talks about, a quiet, overlooked Saturday sitting in the gap. Ask most people what happened on that middle day, and you will get a blank look, or a shrug, or a guess that nothing much happened at all, that it was just a pause, a waiting period, the intermission between the tragedy and the triumph. And that is precisely the day, according to Scripture, on which the single most decisive rescue operation in the entire story was quietly carried out. The most important day in the sequence is the one that got left off almost everyone's calendar. There is a very human reason that Middle Day tends to vanish from the retelling, and it is worth naming. People are wired to rush toward resolution. Given a story with a terrible low point and a glorious finish, the mind wants to leap straight from the darkness to the dawn and skip whatever sits in between, the way you might fast forward through the slow middle of a film to reach the ending you already know is coming. The Quiet Saturday has no dramatic public event attached to it, nothing you could have watched from the outside, no crowd, no spectacle. From the surface, it genuinely looked like nothing was happening at all, just a sealed tomb and a grieving handful of people waiting for a long weekend to end, and so it got filed, understandably enough, under empty waiting. But some of the most decisive things happen exactly where nothing appears to be happening, out of sight, underneath, in the part of the story nobody thought to keep watching. This is one of those times. Because the body was in the tomb, yes. But we have spent this whole journey establishing that a body is not the whole person, that the conscious self goes somewhere the moment the two parts come unbolted. So the obvious question, the one that clergy have wrestled with for 2,000 years, is simple. Where did he go? If the body lay still in the grave through that silent Saturday, then the living self, the one that does not stay in the dirt, was doing something, somewhere. And the Bible drops a series of hints, scattered across several different letters and speeches, that when you gather them together point in one unmistakable direction. Down. The first hint is almost offhand. One of the letters, working through a completely different argument, mentions in passing that before Christ could ascend to the heights, he first descended, going down into the lower regions of the earth. It is a small aside, easy to miss, tucked into a sentence that is really about something else, but it plants the idea plainly. Before there was any going up, there was a going down, a descent into the depths beneath the surface of the world. The direction is set, and it is not the direction anyone expects a rescue to come from. The second hint is sharper and more specific. In one of the earliest public speeches of the new movement, the speaker reaches back and quotes an old line from the Psalms, a song attributed to David written centuries before, in which the singer expresses confidence that God will not abandon his soul to the realm of the dead, nor let his faithful one experience the full decay of the grave. The speaker then makes a striking argument. David himself obviously died and stayed buried. His tomb was a well-known local landmark, so he could not have been talking only about himself. He was pointing forward, describing someone who really would go down into that realm of the dead and then not be left there. Someone who would enter Hades, that land of the dead we mapped at the very start of our journey, and then walk back out. The old song, in other words, had been quietly predicting a round trip into the underworld long before anyone knew who would make it. The third hint is the one that has been argued over the most, and it is worth handling with care because the wording is genuinely open to more than one reading. One of the letters states that Christ, after suffering in the body, went and made a proclamation to what it calls the spirits in prison. That is the phrase, spirits in prison, and honestly it raises about as many questions as it answers. Who exactly were these imprisoned spirits? What exactly was proclaimed to them? Readers have offered several different answers over the centuries, and we'll get to that honest disagreement in a moment. But at the plainest level, the text establishes something remarkable. During that silent Saturday, the self that had left the body was not idle, not asleep, not waiting around. It was active. It went somewhere with a locked-up population in it, and it delivered a message. Now, gather those three scattered hints into one picture, and a story emerges that most people have simply never had assembled for them. Having gone through the execution, having carried the full weight of the world's wrongdoing and paid what needed paying, the self that stepped out of that body did not float upward to rest. It went down into the realm of the dead, into the very Sheol we have been discussing since the beginning, the great divided waiting room where every soul in history had been gathering and holding. He arrived in the one place that had been collecting the dead since the very first funeral, and he arrived not as a prisoner but as someone with genuine business to conduct. And it is essential to catch the posture of this arrival, because it changes the meaning of everything. He did not stumble into the realm of the dead as one more defeated victim, dragged in like everyone before him, another number added to the endless waiting list. He walked in on purpose, having chosen the whole path deliberately, entering death not because it finally caught him, but because he was going somewhere, and death happened to be the only door that led there. That is the great inversion at the centre of the story. Every other soul in history had arrived in that place as a captive of death, brought low and held fast. This one arrived as death's conqueror, using the grave as an entrance rather than being trapped by it as a cage. The place that had swallowed every human being who ever lived met, for the very first time, someone it could not keep, someone who had come in through the front door specifically in order to walk out the back with the prisoners in tow. It is the difference between a man thrown in jail against his will and a man who strolls inside carrying the keys. It is worth being clear about why a rescue was needed at all, because otherwise the descent floats free as a dramatic set piece, with no cause behind it. Cast your mind all the way back to that sealed garden. The reason the two realms had been walled apart, the reason every soul funneled into a waiting room instead of straight into God's presence, was the fracture that opened at the fall, the debt of a broken humanity that had never been settled. Nothing across all the centuries of waiting had been able to settle it, which is the whole point of the long delay. The faithful on the good side of the waiting room were not being punished, but they were not yet home either, because the barrier itself was still standing. What changed on that weekend was that the barrier finally got dealt with at the source. The execution was not a defeat that the descent then had to rescue, it was the payment that made the descent possible. The debt got covered first, and only then could the one who covered it go down and legitimately walk the waiting prisoners out, because now, at last, there was somewhere better for them to go and a settled account that allowed them to go there. And so the business was a rescue, or more precisely, a liberation. Remember the layout of that place. The two sealed compartments divided by a chasm no one could cross. The faithful resting on the good side, waiting through the long centuries for something they could not name. That is where the descent mattered most. To the ones on the side of rest, the ones who had trusted God across all those generations and died before the way was opened, the arriving figure brought the one piece of news the entire history of the world had been building toward. The debt was settled. The barrier was about to be dealt with. The waiting was over. And more than an announcement, it was an escort out. He did not simply inform them and leave. He led them. Try, for a moment, to feel the weight of that from inside the waiting room. Some of the souls resting on the good side had been there an unimaginably long time, generations stacked upon generations, people who had trusted God on nothing more than a promise, and then died with the promise still unfulfilled, and then waited and waited through the rise and fall of entire civilizations they could not see. They had clung to a hope they were never given any proof of, across a stretch of time so vast it is hard even to hold in the mind. And then, one quiet day, after all of it, the one they had been waiting for without ever quite knowing his face simply arrived, walked in among them, and told them the wait was finally, genuinely over. Whatever else you make of this story, that is a staggering scene to picture. The longest hope in the history of the world paying off all at once, for a crowd that had nearly run out of any earthly reason to expect it. Patience, in that room, turned out not to have been wasted after all. There is a phrase for this in one of the letters, and it is a marvellous muscular image once you unpack it. It describes the ascending Christ as having led captivity itself captive, a slightly puzzling turn of words that resolves into something spectacular. The captives, the ones who had been held so long in that waiting place, were led out. The prison was opened from the inside, not by a distant order signed somewhere far above, but by the one in charge showing up in person to walk the prisoners out the door himself. It was, in the plainest modern terms, a prison break, except the most unusual kind imaginable, the kind where the warden turns out to be on the prisoner's side and personally leads the escape. The good side of Sheol, that peaceful compartment we spent so long describing, was cleared out. Checkout, at long last, had been called. And here is the payoff that connects everything we have covered so far into a single line. Where did those liberated souls go? Not back to the waiting room, obviously, and not yet to the final destination we have not reached. They went to paradise, but paradise in its next form, the second version, no longer a sealed garden on the surface of the earth, but somewhere new that opened up precisely because of what had just been accomplished. That good compartment of Sheol, the bosom of Abraham we watched a certain beggar carried into, emptied out on that quiet Saturday and has stayed empty ever since. The route changed. The forwarding address was upgraded. And every faithful soul that had been waiting there for centuries finally moved on to something better, which is exactly why, as we noted a long way back, death works so differently now than it did in the ancient world. This is the event that changed it. This is the pivot the whole map turns on. It is genuinely worth marvelling that this particular moment gets so little attention because it is the hinge of the entire story. People talk endlessly, and rightly, about the teaching, and about the death, and about the resurrection that followed. But the quiet middle day, the descent, the emptying of the waiting room, tends to get skipped entirely, filed under nothing much happened, when in fact it is the exact moment the good compartment was cleared and the road to a better paradise was thrown open. It is the least discussed and arguably most pivotal day on the calendar, the one that did the actual work of connecting the underworld we started into the paradise we are heading toward. Without it, the faithful of every earlier age would still be waiting. With it, the whole map suddenly links up into one continuous route. Now, in fairness, I promised honesty about the disagreement, and there is real disagreement here, so let me deliver on that. That phrase about proclaiming to the spirits in prison has been read in more than one way across the centuries, and thoughtful people genuinely differ. Some take it to mean exactly what we have described, a descent into the realm of the dead to announce victory and lead the faithful out. Others read the imprisoned spirits not as human souls, but as certain rebellious spiritual beings, and read the proclamation as a declaration of triumph over them rather than a rescue of them. Still others interpret the whole passage more figuratively, as a way of describing something accomplished through the message being preached, rather than a literal journey below. This is old, contested ground, and reasonable readers land in different places on it. So the exact mechanics of what was said, and to whom, remain a fair topic for debate. It is worth appreciating, though, just how old and how mainstream the core belief actually is, quite apart from the disputes over its finer points. For many centuries, Christians across enormously different traditions have stood up and recited a short ancient summary of their faith that includes, right there in the sequence between the death and the rising, a line about him descending to the dead. That single clause has been spoken aloud by more people over more centuries than nearly any other statement about the afterlife, which tells you the core idea was never some obscure fringe notion smuggled in from the margins. It sat near the centre of the story from very early on. What shifted over time, and what still gets debated in commentaries and lecture halls, is the how and the exactly what. The precise nature of the descent, the identity of those addressed, the content of the message delivered. But the fact of a descent, a going down into the realm of the dead before the rising, has been part of the mainstream telling for the better part of 2,000 years. The argument, in other words, is over the details of the event, not over whether the event belongs in the story at all. And whatever the precise wording of that proclamation, the broad shape of the thing is widely accepted across the disagreement, and it is the shape that matters most for our map. A victory won over death, a descent into the place of the dead, and the way opened for the righteous who had been waiting. That is the outline nearly everyone agrees on, even while the footnotes get argued over, and it is the outline that stitches two of our realms together into one. Before that Saturday, Sheol and Paradise were separate chapters that did not obviously connect. After it, they are a single continuous story, the waiting room draining directly into a better place, the captives walked out and rehoused. And if you have been keeping that tree of life in the back of your mind, as I asked, this is the moment to notice that the descent is not an isolated rescue, but a step in the long reopening we have been tracking all along. Remember, the door to the overlap was sealed shut at the garden, and the whole rest of the story is the slow reversal of that sealing. What happened on that quiet Saturday is the hinge where the reversal actually begins to move, the first great turning of a lock that had been shut ever since Eden. The captives walked out toward a paradise that stood closer to God than the waiting room ever had, which means the seam that closed in the garden had just been pried open a little wider than it had been in a very long time. The door is moving again, and it will keep moving stage by stage all the way to an ending where the tree of life stands out in the open once more, though we are getting well ahead of ourselves, and that particular reveal belongs to the very last stop. Which leaves us standing right at the threshold of that better place, the second form of paradise, the one that opened up on that quiet middle day, and that is, remarkably, still open and still being filled at this very moment. Because here is the part that makes all of this more than ancient history. The route that got established on that Saturday is the same route still running today. When a person of faith dies now, they are not waiting in any divided underworld for a rescue that has not yet come. The rescue already came, the road is already open, and they go immediately to a paradise that did not even exist in this form until that door was opened, a place the Bible gives a rather startling name and locates in a rather startling spot. That is exactly where our journey turns next, and it is the closest thing to a genuine glimpse of the good afterlife we're going to get before the very end. The startling name the Bible gives this second form of paradise is the third heaven, and the startling spot it locates it in is, well, exactly where that name suggests, though we will need to unpack what counting heavens even means before that lands properly. This is the version of paradise that opened up on that quiet middle day, the destination the liberated captives were led toward. And here is the part that turns ancient history into something intensely personal. It is still open, and it is still filling up right now, at this very moment. Every person who dies in faith today does not wait in any underworld for a rescue that has not yet arrived. The rescue arrived, the road stands open, and they go straight there, without delay, without a layover, without so much as a form to fill out. The clearest anchor for this comes from a scene we have brushed past a couple of times but never actually opened up, and it involves possibly the least likely candidate for paradise in the entire story. Alongside the execution at the centre of that famous weekend, two others were being put to death, ordinary criminals, and one of them, in the last hours of his life, turns to the dying man beside him and asks simply to be remembered. That is all. No lifetime of good works to point to, no impressive resume of virtue, no time left to go out and fix anything, just a condemned man at the very end of a badly spent life, asking not to be forgotten. And the answer he receives is one of the most extraordinary sentences in the whole book. Today, you will be with me in paradise. Not someday, not eventually, after a long wait, after the resurrection, after the paperwork clears, today. There is something almost scandalous about that scene when you sit with it, and it is worth not rushing past. Here is a man with, by any honest accounting, nothing to offer. He cannot undo what landed him where he is. He has no time left to build a better track record, no opportunity to make amends, no good deeds to stack on a scale. By every system of earning that human beings have ever devised, he is out of options and out of time, and he is welcomed anyway, on the strength of a single turn toward the person beside him. If you were designing an entrance policy meant to reassure the deserving and exclude the unworthy, this is very nearly the opposite of what you would build. It suggests that the door to this paradise never ran on merit in the first place, that it was never about assembling a good enough record but about turning toward the right person, even at the last possible second, which is either wildly unfair or extraordinarily generous, depending entirely on which side of the ledger you happen to be standing on, and the story is quietly betting that most of us, if we are honest, are a good deal closer to the criminal's position than we would ever like to admit. 2 words in that reply do an enormous amount of work, and both matter for our map. The first is that word today, which slams the door shut on any idea of a long unconscious wait between death and arrival. There is no gap here, no centuries-long pause, no dreamless holding pattern. The transition is same day, immediate, effective within hours. The second is the phrase with me, because paradise, in that promise, is not defined primarily as a location with nice features. It is defined as presence, as being with a particular person. The address matters less than the company. Paradise, at its core, is wherever that presence is, which is a very different way of thinking about the good afterlife than the usual real estate approach of gates and streets and amenities. But the single most tantalizing description of this place comes from someone who claims he actually went there and came back, and then, maddeningly, almost refused to talk about it. The Apostle Paul, in one of his letters, describes a man, and he is being coyly modest about the fact that the man is himself, who was caught up into paradise, snatched up into it, and there encountered things so far beyond ordinary experience that he says they simply cannot be put into human words. And here is the detail that matters for our naming. He calls the place he was taken to the third heaven, which raises the obvious question of what the first 2 heavens were, and whether there is some numbered stack of them we ought to know about. It is worth dwelling on that reticence, because it is unusual, and it is telling. Paul was not, generally speaking, a man who struggled to find words. He wrote long, dense, closely argued letters, he debated in public, and he was perfectly happy to describe things most people would rather not discuss. And yet, when it came to what he saw in this place, he essentially clammed up, reporting only that he had heard and seen things a person is not permitted to put into words, that human language simply had no containers for. That is a very different kind of description than the vivid, detailed pictures the Bible gives of, say, the underworld or the coming judgment. Those get spelled out at length. This gets left deliberately blank. And there is a kind of honesty in the blank. Some experiences really do overflow the vocabulary available to describe them, and a witness who admits the overflow rather than reaching for cheap superlatives is, oddly, more believable for it. Paul does not try to sell the place with adjectives. He simply reports that it was beyond what he could carry back in words, and leaves it there, which may be the most persuasive thing he could have done. The framework behind that phrase is actually rather elegant once it is spelled out, and it clears up a great deal of confusion. In the ancient way of thinking, the word we translate as heaven covered more than one thing, arranged in a sort of vertical order. The first heaven was simply the sky, the everyday one, the layer where the clouds sit and the birds fly and the weather happens, the ceiling of the ordinary world. The second heaven was the realm beyond that, the domain of the stars and the vast dark distances, the space above the sky. And the third heaven, the top of the stack, was something else entirely, the dwelling place of God himself, the highest and innermost region, the address where the owner actually lives. So when Paul says he was taken to the third heaven and equates it with paradise, he's not talking about the sky or the stars. He's describing being pulled all the way up to the top floor, the penthouse of reality, and being shown things there so overwhelming that a man who wrote a substantial portion of the New Testament, not generally a man short of words, essentially came back and said he could not describe it. When your most articulate witness returns from a place and reports that language failed him, that is its own kind of testimony. That middle layer, the second heaven, is worth a second glance, because it quietly connects to something we already mapped. Remember the battlefield, the contested region overlaid on our world, the unseen princes and powers doing their invisible contending. A good deal of that activity was understood to take place precisely in that second region, the domain above the everyday sky but below the dwelling of God, the vast in-between where the loyal and the fallen do their unseen work, which gives the vertical picture a certain grim logic. Down at the bottom sits the ordinary world, the first heaven, where we live our visible lives. Above it stretches the contested middle, the second crowded with unseen conflict, and above all of that, out of reach of the contest entirely, sits the third, the untroubled top, the one place the fighting never reaches because it is the dwelling of the one everyone is ultimately answering to. Paul was not taken part way up into the contested middle. He was taken all the way to the top above the reach of the struggle, which is exactly why what he found there was beyond describing. He had gone above the weather of the whole cosmos. A fair question at this point is where, physically, any of this is, whether the third heaven is a literal place you could in principle fly to given a fast enough ship and a very long weekend. And the honest answer is that the up and down language is almost certainly directional rather than literal geography. When the texts speak of ascending and descending, of higher and lower realms, they are describing relationships between dimensions, not distances you could measure with an odometer. The third heaven is not simply a very tall altitude, a matter of getting far enough above the clouds. It is another kind of space entirely, on the other side of that seam we keep returning to, and up is just the most natural word available for pointing towards something nearer to God and further from the ordinary world. Ancient writers reached for vertical language because it was the best tool they had for describing a difference that is not really spatial at all. So no, you could not get there by climbing, and, as we will see shortly, the demons could not get to their prison by digging. The directions are real. They are simply pointing at something other than the kind of distance a map usually measures. Now, this second paradise differs from the first one, the Lost Garden, in a way that is crucial to keep straight, and it goes right back to that idea of the seam between two realms that we built earlier. Recall that Eden was special because the physical and the spiritual overlapped there, touched, breathed the same air, the one address where both worlds were fully in contact. This present paradise is not like that. There is no physical component to it, no landscape you could photograph, no soil, no bodies walking around under a sky. It is a purely spiritual dimension, entirely on the far side of the seam, with none of the physical world folded in, which is a genuinely important distinction, because it means this place, wonderful as it is not a restoration of Eden in full. It is more like half of Eden. It has the nearness to God that the garden had, the presence, the closeness, but it is missing the physical side of the equation altogether. The door has been pried open again toward God, but only on the spiritual side. The physical world is still standing on the far side of the wall, still separated, still waiting. And here, right on cue, our recurring signature reappears, exactly where we were told to expect it. The tree of life, that unmistakable identifying mark of paradise, the one we last saw sealed behind guardians and a turning blade at the garden gate, shows up again in connection with this present paradise. One of the messages near the end of the Bible makes a promise to the faithful that they will be given access to eat from the tree of life, and it locates that tree squarely in the paradise of God. So the very thing that was blocked in Eden, cut off, placed permanently out of reach, is now spoken of as available once more in this second form of paradise to those who arrive there. That is not a coincidence, and it is not decoration. It is the ark doing exactly what we said it would do. The tree tracks the rescue. It was open in the garden, sealed at the fall, and here it is again, back within reach, which tells you the shut door has moved, that the reopening we have been following has genuinely advanced another stage. Where the tree of life is, paradise is, and the tree of life has resurfaced. It is fair to wonder what the souls actually experience there, whether it is a kind of blank restful sleep or something far more alive than that, and the hints we have point firmly toward the latter. Everything we established much earlier about the conscious self-surviving death applies here in its fullest and happiest form. These are not dimmed or dormant souls, they are awake, aware, and at peace, and there is every indication that they remain fully themselves, recognizably who they were, with their memories and their identities intact. The old glimpse we got into the waiting room already showed us that people there knew one another, remembered their lives, and could think and feel and speak. There is no reason to imagine the faithful lost any of that on the upgrade to somewhere far better. If anything, the continuity is part of the comfort. The people who go there do not dissolve into an anonymous cloud of pleasant feeling. They arrive as themselves, and the relationships and recognitions that make a self appear to come right along with them, which is a quietly enormous reassurance for anyone who has ever worried that the good afterlife might mean losing the very things that made you you. Which makes it all the more important to say clearly what this place is not, because it is very easy to get excited and mistake this stop for the final one. This is not the end of the journey. This is not God's last word. As beautiful as this present paradise is, as real as the rest and the presence and the returned tree of life are, it is still, in an important sense, an in-between place, an intermediate state rather than the ultimate destination. And the clearest sign of that incompleteness is a detail that sounds strange at first but matters enormously. The souls who are there now, resting in that presence, are there without their bodies. They are conscious, they are at peace, they are genuinely home in a way the old waiting room never offered, but they have arrived, so to speak, ahead of their own luggage. The physical part of them, the dust half we talked about at the very start, is still down here, still in the ground, still waiting for something that has not happened yet. That waiting has a name and a future event attached to it, one we are going to reach in full a little further along, so we will not unwrap it here. But it is worth holding the shape of the thing. The present paradise is a place of resting souls, anticipating a reunion with bodies that have not yet been raised. It is complete in its comfort, but incomplete in its form. Picture guests who have arrived at a wonderful destination, but whose bags are still somewhere in transit, at peace and well cared for, yet not quite fully assembled, still missing a piece that is on its way. That is the honest status of this second paradise. It is a 5-star place in every respect except that the story it belongs to is simply not over, and everyone there knows it. There is a very practical comfort folded into all of this, and it would be a shame to map the third heaven without naming it plainly. For anyone who has stood at a graveside and wondered where a person of faith actually went in that moment, this is the answer the Bible offers. Not into a long dark wait, not into nothing, not into some vague dissolving mist, but straight into the presence we have been describing immediately that very day. The body remained behind, and grief over that is real and appropriate and not to be waved away. But the person, on this account, did not linger in the ground or drift in some unconscious limbo. They arrived. Wherever else the story goes from here, that particular stop is one of the gentler things on the entire map, and it is meant to be held on to. So the cleanest way to keep it in mind is this. The present paradise is Eden's soul without Eden's body, and that is precisely why it cannot be the finale, because the whole thrust of this story, as we have seen since the garden, is toward getting both halves back together, the seam not merely pried open on one side but fully closed into one. That total reunion is a separate destination, the third and final form of paradise, an entirely new earth we will save for the very end. Where the faithful go the instant they die today is genuinely wonderful. It is simply not the last thing. It is the beautiful penultimate stop, and the best, as they say, is still being kept for last. Now we need to turn, rather abruptly, from the most comforting region on our map to one of the most unsettling, because the same map that has a penthouse also has a dungeon, and it is time to go down into it. Cast your mind back to the battlefield, to that unsettling question we deliberately left dangling. We noted that among the unseen population sharing our planet, some of the fallen spirits roam free while others are already locked away, chained in the dark, and we said the reason for that split had a genuinely disturbing answer that was coming later. This is later. And to understand the answer, we first have to understand the place they are locked in, because it is unlike anything else we have mapped so far. This realm is called the Abyss, and it is arguably the most peculiar of all the dimensions we have visited for one simple reason. God appears to have built it for an extremely specific purpose, the way a prison is built for an extremely specific purpose. Consider the contrast with somewhere we already know well. The old waiting room of the dead, that divided holding area, was a place for human souls, a temporary lodging for people between death and what came next. The Abyss is nothing like that. It was never meant for people at all. It is a purpose-built containment facility for the demonic, a maximum security wing designed to hold spiritual beings rather than human ones. If the old waiting room was the general population, the Abyss is solitary confinement, reserved for a particular class of prisoner, and the accommodations, by every indication, are considerably worse. It is worth pausing on the sheer fact that such a place exists at all, because it tells you something about how this whole cosmos is supposedly ordered. A universe with a purpose-built prison in it is a universe that takes wrongdoing seriously enough to have a plan for it, that does not simply let the worst offenders wander off into the dark unaccounted for. There is a certain grim reassurance buried in that. The Abyss is not evidence of a world spinning out of control. It is evidence of a world with a justice system, however severe, and with somewhere specific to put the beings that overstep even the generous boundaries the fallen were given. An empty cell is a strange thing to find comforting, but the existence of the cell means someone is keeping the books, that the account is being tracked, that overreach has consequences filed and waiting. In a story we have already seen runs on permission and limits and a firm chain of command, a maximum security wing for the ones who broke even those limits is not really a surprise. It is the system working exactly as designed. The picture the Bible paints of the place itself is bleak and specific. It is described as a deep place, a bottomless shaft, a dark pit plunging down further than any bottom, sealed at the top. Think of the deepest, darkest well you can imagine, and then remove the bottom of it entirely, so there is only endless downward dark and you begin to approach the image. This is not a waiting lounge with an uncertain departure time. This is a locked-down hole in the fabric of things, a place of confinement and restraint, and the beings held in it are not idly waiting for a number to be called. They are being kept, sealed away, held under guard. There is something almost dizzying about the idea of a spirit being imprisoned at all when you stop to think about it. A human prisoner is held by physical walls, by locks and bars that work precisely because a body cannot pass through solid stone. But how do you cage a being that has no body, that is not made of the kind of stuff walls are meant to stop? The Bible does not hand us the engineering diagram, and we should not pretend it does. What it does make clear is that the confinement is real and effective, that these beings genuinely cannot leave, that the restraint, whatever it is made of, actually holds, which implies a form of binding operating on a level well below the physical, a way of restraining a spirit that has nothing to do with iron or stone. It is a reminder that the rules on that other side of the seam are not our rules, and that the authority holding these prisoners is working with tools we do not have names for. The cell is real. We are simply not shown the lock, and here is the detail that tells you just how genuinely awful the place must be. We already noted, back on the battlefield, that when a crowd of fallen spirits once came face to face with real authority, they did not swagger but begged, and specifically pleaded not to be sent somewhere. This is the somewhere. The place those spirits were desperate to avoid, the destination they dreaded above all others, was precisely this abyss. And take a second to appreciate the weight of that. These are beings that spread misery, that oppose everything good, that are frightening to us by their very nature. And they are afraid of this place. When the monsters themselves are terrified of a particular room, you can safely conclude the room is worse than the monsters. Their sheer dread of the abyss is, in a strange way, the most vivid description of it we could ask for. The texts that speak most directly about this containment are brief but heavy. A couple of the letters near the end of the New Testament refer to spiritual beings who sinned and were not spared, but were instead delivered into chains of darkness, held in gloom, kept under lock and reserved for a future judgment. Chains of darkness is a haunting phrase, and it is doing more than sounding dramatic. It describes a portion of the fallen who are not free agents wandering the world at all, but bound, restrained, sealed away in advance of a reckoning still to come. They are not being punished in full yet. They are being held, the way a prisoner awaiting trial is held, in a cell they cannot leave until the day their case finally comes up. It is detention, in other words, not yet the sentence. Notice too that this business of being held now against a judgment still to come is not unique to the abyss. It is starting to look like a pattern woven through the whole map. The human souls in the old waiting room were held too, pending a reckoning that had not yet arrived. These bound spirits are held pending a reckoning of their own. Across the board, the logic is the same: a period of containment now, a formal accounting later, and nobody, human or spiritual, receiving their final and permanent verdict just yet. The whole cosmos, on this picture, is running on a kind of hold now, judge later arrangement, with different holding areas for different kinds of prisoner, but the same underlying rule. Everyone is somewhere temporary, awaiting a day that has been scheduled but not yet reached, which means the abyss, for all its horror, is still not the end of the line even for the beings inside it. It is detention, not the sentence. The sentence, for them as for everyone else, comes later, at a courtroom we have not yet visited, which lands us squarely back on the question we have been circling for a long time now, and it is a fair and obvious one. If these bound spirits and the free-roaming demons are all fallen, all on the same side, all opposed to the good, then why the difference in treatment? Why are some of them chained in a bottomless dark pit while others are apparently allowed to move about the world more or less freely, causing their particular brand of trouble? They are all guilty of the original rebellion. So what did the imprisoned ones do that the roaming ones did not, that earned them the maximum security wing while their colleagues stayed out on what amounts to parole? That asymmetry has been quietly bothering us since the battlefield, and it deserves an actual answer. Here I need to be upfront that the answer takes us into territory where the Bible is more suggestive than explicit. So what follows is best understood as a leading theory rather than a flat settled fact. Reasonable readers hold different views, and I will flag the uncertainty rather than paper over it. But the most compelling explanation, the one that ties the loose threads together, runs like this. The fallen spirits who ended up chained in the abyss may be there because they crossed a particular line, committed a specific transgression so far beyond the bounds of what even fallen beings were permitted that it earned them a punishment the ordinary rebels never received. In other words, all of the fallen are guilty of the first rebellion, but a subset of them went on to do something additional, something worse, something that got them pulled off the board entirely and locked away. And the specific event the theory points to is one of the strangest and most cryptic passages in the entire Bible. A handful of verses near the beginning of the story that most people read straight past without noticing how genuinely bizarre they are. The text describes a time when certain beings it calls the sons of God, understood in this reading to be some of these fallen spirits, involved themselves with human women, the daughters of men, in a way that reached across the boundary between the spiritual and the physical, between their kind and ours. And the result of this crossing was a line of unusual offspring, described as giants, mighty figures of great renown, referred to by an old name that translates roughly to the fallen ones. Half in one world and half in another, these were the products of a union that was never supposed to happen, a blurring of two categories that had been kept firmly separate. In the spirit of being straight with you, I should note that this passage is one of the most debated few verses in the entire Bible, and the fallen spirit reading we are following is not the only one on offer. Some interpreters take the phrase we are rendering as the sons of God to mean something entirely human, the line of a godly family branch intermarrying unwisely with an ungodly one, no spiritual beings involved at all. Others read it as a matter of powerful human rulers, ancient kings and tyrants taking whatever wives they wanted and fathering a violent warrior class. On those readings, the offspring are simply notable or brutal humans, not hybrids of any kind, and the whole episode is about human corruption rather than any boundary crossing from the spiritual side. These are serious readings held by serious people, and they carry the advantage of not requiring anything supernatural at all. The reason many still favour the fallen spirit interpretation, especially in connection with the abyss, is that it is the one the later texts about chained spirits seem to lean toward, and it is the one that actually solves our puzzle about why some of the fallen are locked away and others are not. So we are following it not because the alternatives are foolish, but because it is the reading that connects the dots across the map. Just know that the dots can be connected in more than one way, and honest people do. If that reading is correct, then it supplies exactly the missing piece we have been looking for. The particular fallen spirits who attempted this crossing, who reached across the boundary and produced these hybrid offspring, may have committed precisely the transgression that got them locked away in the abyss, chained in the dark, removed from circulation entirely, while the rest of the fallen who did not participate remained free to roam. It would explain the asymmetry cleanly. The chained ones did the additional forbidden thing, the free ones did not. And it would also account for a rather conspicuous silence in the rest of the story. After that early episode, we never again hear of the fallen attempting anything remotely like it. The strange union does not recur. It is as if a lesson was very firmly delivered and very thoroughly learned, and that conspicuous silence afterward is worth lingering on, because it may reframe the entire strategy of the fallen from that point forward. If a portion of them was sealed away for reaching across the boundary and producing those offspring, then the ones who remained free appear to have drawn a very clear conclusion: never again. That particular door was closed permanently, at a cost none of them wanted to pay a second time. And so, on this reading, the free-roaming fallen shifted tactics entirely. Unable, or rather unwilling, to cross the line the way that earlier group had, they turned instead to the methods we described back on the battlefield, the ones that do not require crossing any forbidden boundary: influence, deception, and the occasional attempt to inhabit rather than to breed. It is a grimly rational pivot when you think about it. Denied one avenue at a catastrophic price, they redirected their entire effort into the avenues that remained open and unpunished. Which would mean the quiet, whispering, mind-clouding strategy we sketched earlier is not their first preference, but their fallback. The plan they settled on only after the more direct approach got a large number of their colleagues thrown into a bottomless dark hole. Even the darkness apparently learns from its mistakes and adjusts the business model accordingly. Which points to a genuinely chilling implication, and it reframes the behaviour of every free-roaming demon we discussed on the battlefield. If a portion of the fallen were sealed in the abyss specifically for crossing that line, then the ones still walking free are operating with full knowledge of what happens when you go too far. They have seen the maximum security wing. They know it is real, they know it is occupied by their own kind, and they know exactly what sort of overreach lands you there. And that knowledge, according to this theory, functions as a leash of its own, a self-imposed restraint layered on top of the permission system we already described. The roaming demons stay within certain bounds not out of any goodness, obviously, but out of pure self-preservation, because they have watched what became of the ones who coloured too far outside the lines. Even the darkness, it turns out, has a line it does not dare cross twice, and the abyss is the standing reminder of exactly why. Before we go any further, one clarification will save a lot of confusion down the road, because it is very easy to hear all this and quietly assume the abyss is simply hell by another name. It is not. The abyss, for all its dread, is still a holding facility, a place of confinement before a final judgment, not the ultimate and permanent destination for evil. There is another realm still ahead of us on the map, a genuinely final one, reserved for the very end of the story, and it is a different place with a different and far more permanent character. The distinction matters, and it matters in the same way the distinction between the old waiting room and the final verdict mattered for humans. Just as the dead were once held temporarily before their reckoning, the bound spirits are held temporarily before theirs. The abyss is the cell, not the courtroom, and certainly not the final address. We will reach that final address near the end of everything, and when we do, it will turn out that even the abyss itself is only a way station on the road to something more conclusive. For now, keep the two firmly separate. This is a prison for the interim, not the last word on anyone. So the abyss sits on our map as a purpose-built prison, distinct from every other realm we have visited, holding a particular class of the fallen in chains of darkness against a future judgment, dreaded even by the demons who managed to stay out of it, and standing as a permanent warning to the ones still at large. It is in a sense the most orderly of all the dark places, a cell with a clear purpose and a clear inmate list. But here is the detail that turns this from a static description into a genuine setup, and it is where we are heading next. A prison, however deep and however dark, is defined by the fact that it can, at least in principle, be opened, and according to the final book of the Bible, at a certain point in the story still to come, this particular bottomless shaft does not stay sealed forever. Someone is handed a key, the lid comes off, and what climbs out when the abyss is finally opened is the single most nightmarish image in the entire book, which is exactly where our journey turns next. To watch that pit get opened, we have to jump forward to the final book of the Bible, where the whole story rushes toward its climax through a long sequence of escalating disasters, each one announced by the blast of a trumpet. These are not the celebratory kind of trumpets. They are more like a series of increasingly alarming announcements, each worse than the last, counting down toward the end of the age. And it is the fifth of these trumpets that concerns us, because it is the moment the door we spent the last stretch describing finally comes off its hinges. A quick word of guidance before we go any further, because this final book is notorious for sending readers into a spiral, and a little orientation saves an enormous amount of confusion. It is written almost entirely in vivid coded imagery, a cascade of symbols, visions, beasts, numbers, and cosmic special effects, and it was never meant to be read like a literal news report of events unfolding in neat sequence. Much of it works the way a political cartoon works, packing big ideas into striking pictures that carried clear meaning to its original audience, and can look baffling to everyone since. So when we run into a falling star with a key or a swarm of armoured locusts, the right question is usually not what species is that, but what does that picture represent? Some of it is meant more literally and some more symbolically, and honest readers argue endlessly about which is which. We are going to walk through the images, explain the most widely held sense of them, and firmly resist the temptation to nail every last detail down into a precise calendar, because people who insist they have the whole thing decoded to the day have a long and unbroken record of turning out to be wrong. Held loosely, though, the broad shape of what the book is showing comes through clearly enough, and it is genuinely worth seeing. When that fifth trumpet sounds, the vision describes something falling from the sky, and it uses the word star. But this is not a burning rock plummeting toward the ground, and reading it that way misses the point entirely. Throughout this kind of writing, a star falling from heaven is a recognized image for a spiritual being coming down, specifically a fallen one, an angel cast out of the heights. And this falling figure arrives carrying something very particular, a key. Now, as a general rule, a key is a reassuring object, a symbol of access and order, and locked doors kept safely locked. But a key is only as comforting as the door it opens, and the door this one fits is the shaft of the abyss, that bottomless prison we just finished mapping. A key to the deepest holding cell in creation, handed to a fallen being at the worst possible moment, is not the sort of detail that lets anyone relax. There is a small grammatical detail in that moment that carries a surprising amount of weight. The key is given to him. He does not seize it, does not pick the lock, does not smash his way in. It is handed over. And that quiet, passive verb, given, tells you the same thing we have been noticing since the very beginning of the dark side of this story. Even here, even at the unleashing of the worst prison in creation, the fallen being does not act on his own authority. The key comes from somewhere higher up. The opening of the abyss is not a breakout staged by the inmates against the wishes of the management. It is something permitted, allowed, granted at an appointed moment as part of a larger sequence. That does not make what follows any less terrible, but it does keep the whole scene inside the same framework we established all the way back on the battlefield, where nothing on the dark side happens without sign-off from above. The pit opens on schedule and by permission, not by accident and not by conquest, which is a strangely steadying thing to hold in mind while the sky is going dark. And so the lock turns, and the pit is opened, and the very first thing that happens is not an army pouring out, but smoke. Thick black smoke billows up out of the shaft, rising like the exhaust from an enormous furnace, so much of it that it blots out the sun and darkens the sky itself. The daylight fails, the air goes foul and dim. Before anything even emerges, the atmosphere of the whole scene has already curdled, which is a genuinely effective piece of dread when you think about it. The pit does not announce itself with a monster. It announces itself with a change in the weather, the sky going dark and choked, the way the air feels wrong before a disaster you cannot yet see. The smoke itself is worth reading as more than just special effects. Smoke that pours out of a pit and swallows the sun is a fitting image for what the abyss actually holds, because the thing about concentrated evil is that it obscures, it darkens, it makes it harder to see clearly, harder to find the light, harder to tell up from down. So the very first effect of the pit opening, before a single creature appears, is a kind of spiritual dimming of the whole world, a thickening of the air that makes truth harder to make out. Whether you take the darkened sun literally, or as a picture of something deeper, the meaning rhymes either way. When that much darkness gets loosed at once, the first casualty is clear sight, and everything that follows happens in a world that can no longer see straight. Then, out of that rolling smoke, the creatures come. The vision describes them as locusts, and if you know anything about locusts, your first instinct is to picture a swarm stripping the fields bare, because that is the one thing locusts are famous for, the devouring of every green and growing thing in their path. But here the text does something quietly startling. It reverses the one rule you thought you could count on. These particular locusts are expressly forbidden from touching the grass, the plants, the trees, any of the vegetation at all. The greenery, for once, is completely safe, which is precisely backwards from everything a locust is supposed to be, and that reversal is the entire point. These are not really insects. The locust shape is a disguise, a familiar image borrowed to describe something that is not an insect at all, and the tell is right there in the fact that they ignore the one thing real locusts live to destroy. Their appetite has been pointed somewhere else entirely, because what they are permitted to harm is not the plants but the people, and even there the targeting is remarkably precise. They are allowed to go after only those human beings who do not carry a certain mark on their foreheads, a seal placed there by God as a sign of protection and belonging. Everyone bearing that seal is off limits, untouchable, passed over completely. Everyone without it is exposed, so the swarm moves through the world like a force with a very specific guest list, checking foreheads, sparing the sealed, and closing in on the unsealed. It is an unsettling image of a judgment that distinguishes sharply between two groups of people, one shielded and one not, and it makes clear that whatever else is going on, this is not random chaos. It is aimed. It is worth dwelling on the reassuring half of that sorting, because it is easy to fixate on the exposed group and miss the sheltered one. The seal on the forehead is, at bottom, a mark of ownership in the best possible sense, a sign that a person belongs to God and is claimed by him, and it functions here as a kind of divine immunity. Those who carry it are simply not on the menu. The swarm passes over them entirely, in much the way an ancient plague once passed over the households that bore the right mark on their doorframes. There is real comfort in that image for anyone unsettled by the horror of the scene, because it says the terror is not indiscriminate, that there is a whole category of people it cannot touch no matter how dark the sky gets. The point of the vision is not that everyone is doomed to be tormented by nightmare insects. The point is that a line has been drawn, that belonging to God is a real and effective shelter, and that the seal, whatever exactly it represents, actually works. And here is a small mercy, if you can call it that, folded into the horror. For all their menace, these creatures are not permitted to kill anyone. Their assignment is torment, not death, and they are given a strict and oddly specific time limit for it. 5 months. Not forever, not indefinitely, but 5 months, and then it stops. There is a dry detail worth noticing here, which is that 5 months happens to be roughly the natural lifespan of an actual locust. So even in its most nightmarish imagery, the vision keeps 1 foot planted in the ordinary creature it is borrowing from. But the deeper point is the limit itself. Even now, even at the opening of the worst prison in creation, even with the sky darkened and the swarm loosed, the damage is bounded. There is a leash on this, exactly as there has been a leash on the fallen from the very beginning. They can torment, but only these people, but only this long, but never past the line drawn for them. The restraint we noticed all the way back on the battlefield is still holding, even here, even at the climax. There is one further detail about that 5-month ordeal that is genuinely haunting, and it conveys just how severe the vision means the scene to be. The text says that during those months the people being tormented will seek death, and be unable to find it, longing to die while death flees from them. Take a moment with how bleak that inversion is. Normally death is the thing human beings fear most and flee from hardest. Here the situation is so upended that death becomes the escape people desperately want and cannot have, held permanently just out of reach. Now, this is heavy imagery, and it is worth saying plainly that it is describing a symbolic vision of a future judgment, not a manual for anyone's present, so no one should read their own dark hours into it. Within the vision, though, it drives home the seriousness of the scene in a way nothing else quite manages, and it is precisely why this whole passage is so often called the most frightening in the entire book. Now for the description of the creatures themselves, which is where the vision fully abandons any pretense that we're talking about bugs. They are portrayed as a kind of assembled nightmare, a composite stitched together from the least reassuring features of several different things at once. They are shaped, the text says, like horses arrayed for battle, which sets the scale as something far larger and more formidable than any insect. On their heads sit what look like crowns of gold, giving them a horrible parody of royalty. Their faces resemble human faces, which is somehow the worst detail of all, because a monster with a human face is far more disturbing than one without. They have long hair, described as being like a woman's, and teeth like a lion's, all fangs and force. Their bodies are armoured, plated in what looks like iron, so they cannot easily be struck down, and behind them they carry tails like a scorpion's, complete with stings, and it is in those tails that their power to torment resides. It reads like a creature designed by a committee that was specifically instructed to make it as unsettling as possible, borrowing a piece here and a piece there, until nothing about it lines up with anything you have ever seen and every part of it trips a different alarm. And these swarming horrors are not leaderless. They have a king, and unlike almost everything else in this dense and symbolic vision, the king is actually named, which tells you he matters. In the Hebrew, his name is given as Abaddon. In the Greek, it is rendered Apollyon, and both of those names carry the same meaning, translated plainly as the destroyer. He is identified as the Angel of the Abyss, the ruling spirit over that bottomless prison, and now, apparently, the commander of what comes out of it when the lid is lifted. A being whose actual name is the Destroyer is not one who leaves much to the imagination, and it is a fair guess he is not handing that name out on a business card. The name is worth sitting with, because destruction is precisely the opposite of what the good side of this whole story has been doing. Everything we have traced, the rescue from the waiting room, the reopening of the sealed garden, the raising of bodies still to come, has been fundamentally about building, restoring, and putting back together what was broken. And here, ruling the pit, is a being whose entire identity is summed up in the single word for tearing down. That is the essential contrast of the whole cosmic drama in miniature. One side devoted to restoration, the other defined by ruin, one working to reunite what was split, the other content only to break. A being named the Destroyer is not a complicated villain with hidden depths. He is exactly what it says on the label, which is somehow more chilling than any elaborate backstory could ever be. It is worth asking why a book so full of comfort and hope would include a passage this genuinely frightening at all, because the horror is plainly not there for its own sake. Visions like this one function as warnings, in much the way a storm siren functions, unpleasant by design and precisely for that reason. The point is not to wallow in the terror, but to make the stakes unmistakable, to shake anyone reading out of the comfortable assumption that how a person lives and what they trust makes no ultimate difference in the end. A story that only ever soothed would not be telling the truth about a world that clearly contains real danger. So the darkness in these chapters is doing an actual job. It is drawing the contrast as sharply as it possibly can between the two roads the rest of our map lays out, and it is trusting the reader to notice which one leads down through the smoke and which one does not. Here, though, we run into a genuine puzzle in the text, and it would be dishonest to smooth it over, so let us look at it directly. A little later in the same book, there is a figure referred to as the Beast, a central villain of the end times drama, and the vision says this beast comes up out of the abyss, which fits neatly with everything we have been discussing about that pit and what it contains. But then, in a different passage, that same beast is described rising up out of the sea instead. So which is it? The abyss or the sea? The text seems to say both, and at first glance that looks like a contradiction, the sort of thing skeptics love to point at and believers sometimes prefer not to mention. One proposed way of resolving the tension, and I will flag clearly that this is an interpretation rather than a settled fact, treats the two origins as describing two different aspects of the same thing. On this reading, the beast is not merely a person, and not merely a spirit, but a combination of the two, a demonic power, a destructive spirit released from the abyss, which then takes up residence in and works through a human being. The abyss accounts for the spiritual source, the origin of the malignant power itself. The sea, in this old symbolic vocabulary, often stands for the mass of restless humanity, the nations and peoples in churning turmoil, so a beast rising from the sea can point to a human figure emerging out of that churn. Put the two together and you get a picture of a spirit from the pit, inhabiting a person from among the peoples, which would let both descriptions be true at once, each pointing at a different layer of the same figure. It is a tidy solution to a real puzzle, and it echoes the pattern we already saw with the Fallen, who prefer to work through people rather than appear on their own. This is a good moment to say something that applies to this entire corner of the subject. The end times material attracts more confident speculation and more spectacularly failed predictions than almost any other topic in the whole religion. Every generation seems to produce people utterly certain they have identified the beast, pinned down the timeline, and decoded exactly how it all unfolds, usually with themselves conveniently living in the final generation, and the track record of these confident decoders is, to put it gently, not good. So the responsible way to handle a puzzle like a beast rising from two different places is to lay out the tension honestly, offer the most reasonable proposed reading, mark it plainly as a proposal, and then decline to build an elaborate scheme on top of it. The broad message of the passage, that a great deceiving power opposed to God will arise and ultimately be defeated, is clear enough. The specific mechanics are foggy on purpose, and pretending otherwise has made a great many people look foolish over the centuries. But the abyss has one more appearance to make in this story, and it is the most satisfying of them all because it closes a circle we opened chapters ago. Near the very end of the final book, after the worst of the drama has played out, the vision describes the ultimate ringleader himself, the original defector, the prince who claimed the whole planet, being seized, bound, and thrown down into that same bottomless pit, which is then locked and sealed over him for a set span of 1,000 years. Sit with the irony of that for a moment. The abyss, that prison we described as the place the fallen dread above all others, the maximum security wing they begged not to be sent to, ends up holding the greatest of the fallen of all. The one who had spent the entire story sending others into darkness is himself locked into the dark. The warden becomes an inmate. What exactly that 1,000-year span involves, and what happens when it finally ends, belongs to the very last stretch of our journey, and we will not spoil it here. For now, it is enough to notice that the pit which opened to unleash horror in the middle of the story swings shut at the end to contain the worst horror of all, which is about as complete a bookend as any story could ask for. So that is the dramatic peak of the demonic theme. The door opened and the door shut, the destroyer loosed and the great enemy finally chained. But horror is not where this story is heading, and it would be a mistake to leave you standing at the edge of that dark pit, because the map has a far brighter half still to come. To reach it, though, we have to pause and understand a single event that everything at the end depends on, one we have been circling and postponing for a very long time now. Remember those resting souls in the present paradise, complete in comfort but incomplete in form, waiting, as we put it, for their luggage to arrive. It is time at last to find out what they are waiting for. The event is the resurrection, and the first thing to understand about it is how sweeping it actually is. This is not a special privilege reserved for a chosen few, and it is not a vague spiritual metaphor for the soul carrying on. It is bodily, and it is universal. Every single human being who has ever lived and then died will, according to this, be raised again in a body. Everyone. Not just the faithful, not just the famous, not just the ones whose graves are still marked and tended. Everyone! And here is the part that tends to trip people up. It does not matter in the slightest what happened to the original body along the way. Buried, burned, lost at sea, scattered to the four winds, dissolved to nothing centuries ago in some forgotten field, none of it presents the slightest obstacle. The one who assembled a human being out of dust in the first place is not going to be stumped by the question of where the dust ended up. Reconstructing a person is not a harder problem than constructing them was to begin with, and that first construction, if the story is to be believed, went fine. But universal as it is, the resurrection does not happen all at once, in a single undifferentiated moment, and this is the crucial structural point. It comes in two distinct stages, involving two different groups of people, and leading to two dramatically different outcomes. Two resurrections, in other words, separated in time and opposite in character, and keeping them straight is essential to understanding everything that follows. It is a bit like the difference we already drew between two very different judgments waiting at the end, except here it applies to the raising of the dead. One resurrection is the best possible news, the other is the worst, and which one you are part of makes, quite literally, all the difference in the world. The first resurrection is the joyful one, and it is tied to the return of Christ. When that return happens, according to the promise, every person who belonged to him receives something staggering, a new body, a transformed body, one described as being like the very body of the risen Jesus himself. And this is where a lot of people quietly misunderstand what resurrection even means, because they picture it as a kind of resuscitation, the old corpse simply reanimated, the same tired body coughed back to life with all its old problems intact. That is emphatically not the picture. What is promised is not a repair job on the old model, but an entirely new addition, an upgrade so thorough that the old body relates to the new one roughly the way a seed relates to the full-grown plant that eventually rises from it, which, as it happens, is exactly the image the Bible reaches for to explain it. There is a reason the believer's resurrection is described as coming at Christ's return and not before, and it connects to a rather beautiful piece of the logic. The risen Jesus is described as the first fruits of the whole resurrection, which is an old agricultural term worth unpacking. In a harvest, the first fruits were the very first portion of the crop to come in, gathered ahead of the rest, and they served as a kind of guarantee and preview of the full harvest that would follow. The first ripe sheaf told you the rest was on its way, and showed you what it would look like. Applied here, the idea is that Jesus was the first human being ever raised into one of these glorified, imperishable bodies, going first, blazing the trail, and that everyone who belongs to him follows the same pattern afterward, at his return, as the main harvest brought in behind that first sheaf. This is why the sequence has the shape it does, and it also explains why the promise is not merely wishful thinking floated with no evidence. The claim is that the pattern has already been demonstrated once, in one confirmed case, and that the rest of the crop simply matches the sample already gathered. Whatever you make of the claim, it is at least a coherent structure. One has already gone through it, and the rest follow in the same manner. There is a passage that lays out that transformation in careful detail, walking through it as a series of contrasts, and it is worth taking slowly because each contrast adds something. It begins with the seed idea. What gets planted in the ground is not what comes up out of it. You bury something that looks like a dry, unremarkable kernel, and what emerges bears almost no visible resemblance to what went in. In the same way, the passage says, "The body that is sown in death is not the body that is raised." Then it stacks up the specific differences. What is sown is perishable, subject to decay, the kind of thing that breaks down and rots. What is raised is imperishable, beyond the reach of decay entirely, built to last in a way nothing in our current experiences. What is sown is marked by dishonour, by all the indignity that comes with a failing, dying body. What is raised is clothed in glory. What is sown is characterised by weakness, by the aches and the frailty, and the alarming way the knees eventually stop cooperating. What is raised is defined by power. And finally, what is sown is a natural body, suited to this ordinary physical life. What is raised is a spiritual body, suited to a mode of existence we do not yet have the equipment to fully imagine. Not a ghost, notice, and not a bodiless spirit, but a spiritual body, a real physical form somehow perfectly fused with and animated by the spiritual, which is a category most of us have never encountered and can barely picture. It helps that we are not left to imagine this transformed body entirely from scratch, because the risen Jesus is offered as the working preview of exactly what is being promised, and the descriptions of him after the resurrection are fascinating precisely because of how they refuse to fit any tidy category. On one hand, this was unmistakably a real physical body, not a ghost and not a shared hallucination. The accounts are almost insistent on the point. He could be touched. He ate food in front of people. He had a body solid enough to handle. Whatever a glorified body is, it is not a wispy phantom. And yet, on the other hand, this same body could apparently do things no ordinary body can, appearing inside rooms whose doors were shut, coming and going in ways that startled everyone present. So the preview shows us something genuinely new, a body more physical than our own, in the sense of being permanent and indestructible, yet also freed from some of the limitations we take for granted, at home in both the physical and the spiritual at once. That is the model the promise points to. Not less than a body, but more than one. An upgrade so far beyond the current version that the risen Jesus becomes the only available illustration of what is coming. And that last contrast, the natural body giving way to the spiritual one, is the one that ties directly back into the whole arc we have been tracing, so it deserves a moment of its own. Cast your mind all the way back to how a human being was first assembled. Dust and breath, the physical and the spiritual bolted together into one creature. Then recall that ever since the garden gate slammed shut, those two realms have been divided, and that even the wonderful present paradise, as we noted, has recovered only half the picture. The spiritual half, leaving the resting souls there without their physical bodies still waiting. The resurrection is the moment that gap finally closes for good. For the first time since Eden, the physical and the spiritual are not merely touching, not merely overlapping at a seam, but fully and permanently joined in a single glorified body, wonderfully integrated in a way that was never quite achieved before, not even in the garden. The luggage arrives, the two halves are reunited, the creature is finally completely whole. This is what those resting souls have been anticipating all along, and it is a great deal better than merely getting the old body back. Now for the sobering half, because the two-stage structure means there is a second resurrection, and it could hardly be more different in tone. Those who did not belong to Christ are also raised bodily, every one of them, but not at the same time and emphatically not for the same purpose. Their raising comes later, after the events tied to that 1,000-year span we mentioned, and it leads not to glory but to judgment. The texts are direct about this two-way split. One of them speaks of a coming hour when all who are in their graves will hear a voice and come out. some to a resurrection of life and others to a resurrection of judgment. An old prophetic passage says much the same, describing many who sleep in the dust awakening, some to everlasting life and some to shame and lasting contempt. So the resurrection itself is not automatically good news for everyone. Being raised is universal. What you are raised for is not. For one group, it is the dawn of everything they hoped for. For the other, it is being called out of the ground to face something they spent their whole lives avoiding. Same event, opposite meaning, and the difference lies not in the raising but in the destination it delivers you to. In fairness, it should be said that Christians do not all line up on precisely how this two-stage picture works out in the details. The broad conviction that the dead will be raised bodily, and that this leads to sharply different destinies for different people, is held very widely across the traditions. But the finer questions, whether the two resurrections are separated by a long span or are two aspects of a single great event, how exactly the timing maps onto the other end times pieces and so on, are debated, and thoughtful believers land in genuinely different places. Some read the sequence as two clearly separated events with a long interval between them. Others read the language of two resurrections as describing one general raising of everyone at once, immediately sorted into two outcomes. We have been presenting the staged version because it fits cleanly with the wider map we have been drawing, but it is worth knowing that the traffic pattern here is disputed even among people who fully agree that the resurrection is real and universal. The destination is not in question. The exact route and schedule are where the honest disagreement lives. Underneath all of this sits a theological point that is easy to miss, but genuinely important, and it corrects a misconception a lot of people carry around without realizing it. Many assume that the whole goal of salvation is to escape the body, to shed the physical world like a dirty coat, and float off as a pure disembodied spirit, as if the material side of existence were the problem to be solved. The resurrection flatly contradicts that. If the ultimate plan were to ditch the physical and keep only the spiritual, there would be no reason to raise bodies at all. You could simply leave everyone as resting souls forever. But that is not the plan. God goes to the considerable trouble of raising and glorifying the body, precisely because the body was never the enemy. It was good creation, called good along with everything else at the very beginning, and the one who called it good is apparently not in the habit of discarding things he called good. The aim was never to rescue half of a person out of a physical world written off as garbage. The aim was to redeem the whole person, body included, and to redeem the physical world along with it, which is a far more ambitious and far more hopeful project than the escape the body version most people assume. There is a warmth to this doctrine that often gets buried under the technical details, and it is worth surfacing before we move on. The promise of a bodily resurrection means that the specific physical person you have loved and lost is not simply gone, not reduced to a disembodied wisp or an abstract memory, but is destined to exist again as a whole person, embodied, recognizable, themselves. It means the physical life we live now, with all its ordinary bodily texture, the shared meals and the walks and the faces, is not a cheap disposable phase to be embarrassed about and left behind, but the shared meals, the walks, the faces, all of it something God intends to restore and perfect rather than scrap. It is one of the more overlooked treasures on this entire map. The obvious objection, the one that occurs to almost everyone the first time they hear all this, is a practical one. How on earth could that possibly work? Bodies decay completely. Their atoms scatter, get taken up into soil and plants and other creatures, recycled through the living world many times over across the centuries. The very molecules that once made up an ancient person are now distributed across who knows how many other things. Reassembling all that seems not just difficult, but flatly impossible. And the biblical answer to this is not to explain the mechanism, because it never offers one, but simply to point at scale. The one making the promise is the same one who, on this account, spoke the entire physical universe into being out of nothing at all. Against that backdrop, gathering a scattered person back together is not the hard case. It is the easy one. We tend to assume resurrection is a bigger ask than creation, when logically it is a considerably smaller one, a matter of restoring something that already existed rather than producing something from nothing, which means the promise reaches all the way down to the most literal level imaginable, right down to the dust. Wherever anyone's remains have ended up, however long ago they crumbled, however completely they have vanished from any human record. The claim is that God will call that person back into a whole, an embodied existence to stand before him. It is a promise that treats no grave as too old, no ashes as too scattered, no loss as too total to reverse. And that, finally, is what bridges the whole long middle of our story to its end. We have spent all this time in the intermediate places, the waiting rooms and the resting paradise, the temporary holdings for souls between death and what comes next. The resurrection is the hinge that swings the story out of all those in-between states and into the permanent ones. Once the bodies are raised, the era of waiting is over, and the era of final and everlasting outcomes begins. And those final outcomes, it turns out, are decided at not one but two very different courtrooms, which is exactly where our journey turns next. Almost everyone, when they picture Judgment Day, imagines a single enormous event. One courtroom, one line stretching back through all of history, every human being who ever lived shuffling forward one at a time to have their whole existence weighed on a single set of scales, saints and scoundrels waiting in the same queue for the same verdict. It is a powerful image, and it is very nearly universal, and it is also, according to the Bible, not quite how it works. Scripture actually describes two separate judgments, held for two separate groups of people, at two separate times, for two entirely different purposes, with two completely different outcomes, and once you untangle the two, a topic that usually gets crushed together into one intimidating blur suddenly makes a great deal more sense. The first of the two is reserved for those who already belong to Christ, and it goes by a name that sounds far more ominous than it actually is: the judgment seat of Christ. The original word behind that phrase was a very ordinary one in the ancient world, referring to a raised platform where an official would sit to make rulings, or, notably, where the judge at an athletic contest would sit to award prizes to the winners. And that second sense turns out to be much closer to what is going on here, because this first judgment is not the terrifying trial most people assume. It is not a proceeding where the question of whether a believer is saved gets reopened and relitigated, with salvation hanging nervously in the balance. That question, on this account, has already been settled, resolved by faith long before anyone ever reaches this platform. So this is not a survival trial. It is closer to an awards ceremony, albeit one with unusually high stakes attached to the trophies. The purpose of this first judgment, then, is not to decide anyone's eternal destination, but to evaluate how they actually lived, to assess the quality of what they built with the life they were given, and to hand out rewards accordingly. It is the difference between a court deciding whether you get to keep your freedom and a panel deciding what recognition your work has earned. The eternal outcome is not in doubt here. What is being examined is the substance of a life. It is worth asking why any of this rewarding matters if the ultimate destination is already secure regardless. And the answer is that it matters the way it matters in any life worth living. Not everything reduces to bare survival. A person can be perfectly safe and still have squandered their opportunities, still have built nothing that lasts, still arrive at the end of the road with empty hands. The point of this first judgment is that what you do with your life is not erased or made meaningless by the fact that your ultimate rescue is settled. The two things are simply different questions. One is whether you are safe, the other is what you made of the safety. It is a bit like the difference between being a citizen of a country and actually contributing something to it. Your citizenship might be perfectly secure, but that does not automatically mean you spent it well. This judgment takes the second question seriously, which is really just another way of saying that the life you're living right now genuinely counts for something, that it is not a throwaway prelude to the part that matters, but part of what matters itself. There is a striking passage that describes exactly how that examination goes, using an image that lands hard once you sit with it. The picture it paints is of each person's lifework being tested by fire, the way a builder's materials might be run through a furnace to see what survives. Some people, it says, will have built with gold, silver and precious stones, materials that pass through the flame and come out gleaming, purified rather than destroyed. Others will have built with wood, hay and straw, which is to say the flimsy stuff, and when the fire hits it, it simply goes up in smoke and leaves nothing behind. And here is the crucial and rather merciful detail. Even the person whose whole life's work burns away to ash is still described as being saved, though only, as the text memorably puts it, as one escaping through the flames. Picture someone making it out of a burning building with their life intact but none of their possessions, standing outside in the cold having lost everything they owned but breathing all the same. That is the worst-case scenario at this first judgment. Not condemnation, but the sober experience of watching a wasted life burn off and receiving no reward for it, while still ultimately being safe. It is where the various honours and recognitions promised to the faithful, sometimes described as crowns, get either awarded or forfeited depending on what a person actually did with what they were given. The second judgment could hardly be more different, and its name carries none of the underlying gentleness the first one did. It is called the Great White Throne, and it is the one people are usually picturing when they imagine Judgment Day at its most severe. This is the judgment of everyone who did not belong to Christ, and the scene the Bible paints is stark and formal. A throne, blazing white, with the created order itself seeming to flee from before it, the dead standing to be judged, and then a detail that gives the whole thing the character of a legal proceeding. Books are opened. Records apparently have been kept, a full accounting of deeds, and each person is judged according to what is written in them, according to what they actually did. There is something quietly fair about that detail of the opened books once you notice it. The judgment described here is not arbitrary, not a matter of divine mood or favoritism, not a coin flip. It proceeds according to a record, an actual account of what a person did, which means each person is measured against the truth of their own life rather than against anyone else's, or against some shifting standard applied unevenly. Nobody is judged for someone else's deeds, and nobody's deeds are overlooked or invented. The books are simply what happened. And while that is a sobering thought, since most of us would rather not have a complete and honest record of everything we ever did read back to us, it is also, in its way, a guarantee of justice. This is not a rigged court. Everyone gets the truth of their own life, no more and no less, which is precisely what fairness has always meant, and precisely what human courts have always struggled to deliver. But there is one book among them that matters more than all the ledgers of deeds combined, and its role is decisive in the most literal sense. It is called the Book of Life, and it functions less like a record of behaviour and more like a registry of belonging, a list of names. And the outcome at this throne hinges not on the tally of good deeds versus bad in the other books, but on a single binary question. Is your name written in this one? Everything comes down to that. The one whose name is not found recorded in the Book of Life is, according to the text, cast into the lake of fire, the destination we are about to explore in full. It is a sobering picture precisely because of how it cuts through everything else. All the accumulated deeds in all the other books turn out not to be the hinge. The hinge is the registry, the belonging, the name on the list or its absence, and this is where the two judgments quietly reveal the deepest thing about the whole system, if you hold them side by side. At the first, the believer's works are examined, but their destination was never in question, because it never rested on the works in the first place. At the second, the unregistered are judged by their works, and the works are not enough, because works were never the thing that could put a name in the Book of Life. Both judgments, in their different ways, point at the same underlying truth. The deciding factor was never the accumulated score. It was the belonging. Cast your mind back to that condemned man at the very end of his life, the one who had no works at all to offer and was welcomed anyway, on the strength of a single turn toward the right person. His name went into the book on the basis of belonging, not earning, and these two thrones simply make that principle universal and final. The record matters enormously for reward. It was never what settled the destination, and it is right here, at these two thrones, that something happens which has never fully happened before at any point in the entire story we have been tracing. The line between the two kinds of people becomes, at long last, absolutely and permanently clear. Up until this moment, the faithful and the faithless have been mixed together throughout the whole journey, sharing the same waiting room in the ancient world, sharing the same planet, sharing the same graves. The distinction was always real but never fully visible, never finally drawn. At these two judgments, for the first time in all of history, the sorting is completed and made total. So the three differences are worth fixing firmly in mind, because they are the whole key to the subject. The two judgments happen at different times. They serve entirely different purposes, one to reward and one to reckon, and they lead to opposite outcomes. Lump them together, as almost everyone does, and the topic becomes a confusing tangle. Keep them apart, and it finally clicks into place. And keeping them apart also sets up the two final destinations, because each throne empties out into a different one, and we need to look at both, starting with the darker of the two. The place the Great White Throne delivers the unregistered into is the destination most people simply call hell, and on our map it is the 6th region we have visited, and it should unsettle you more than anything that came before it, including the opened pit and the swarm out of the smoke. It is worth being clear about why this destination should trouble you more than those earlier images, because on the surface they seem more viscerally frightening. The reason comes down to a single word: permanence. Everything dark we have visited up to now has been, in one way or another, temporary. The old waiting room of the dead was an interim holding area. The bottomless prison of the fallen, dreadful as it is a detention cell before a judgment, not the final sentence. Even the tormenting swarm was handed a strict time limit and no permission to kill. All of it was provisional, bounded on the clock. This is the place where the clock finally stops. This is the one destination on the entire map with no exit written into it, no time limit, no further stage beyond it, no scaffolding that will later come down. That is what makes it the genuinely serious one. The earlier horrors were terrible but temporary. This one is simply final, and finality, when you actually sit with it, is far heavier than any amount of dramatic imagery. To understand the word Jesus himself used for it more than almost any other, we have to take a short detour to a very real and very unpleasant location, because he did not reach for an abstract theological term. He reached for a garbage dump. Outside the walls of ancient Jerusalem there was a valley with a grim history and an even grimmer present. Its name, in the local tongue, came into Greek as Gehenna, and in earlier centuries it had been a site of genuinely dark practices, a place where, at the worst points in the region's history, terrible sacrifices had reportedly been carried out. By the time of Jesus, it had become something almost as bleak in a more mundane way, the city's perpetual rubbish heap. It was where the refuse of the whole city was dumped and burned, which meant a fire smouldered there more or less constantly, never fully going out. The decaying garbage bred worms in vast numbers, so the place was described as crawling with them, and the smell, one can safely assume, was not something anyone lingered near by choice. It was, in short, the least appealing piece of real estate in the entire region, a landfill that never stopped burning, which is not generally a feature anyone puts in the brochure. And this is the image Jesus deliberately chose to describe the final fate of the lost. He did not pull a poetic abstraction out of the air. He pointed at a real, notorious, revolting place that everyone listening would have known firsthand, a location associated with fire that never quite died, with decay, with waste, with things cast out and left to rot, and he used it as the picture. That choice is doing real work. By reaching for the town dump rather than some grand cosmic vocabulary, he framed this final fate in terms of exclusion and waste, of being cast outside the city and left in the place where discarded things go. It is a picture of being thrown away, of ending up permanently outside the walls of everything good, in the one location nobody wanted to be anywhere near. There is a phrase attached to this fate that appears again and again, and it is almost always misunderstood, so it is worth correcting carefully. The condemned are described as experiencing weeping and gnashing of teeth. Now, most people hear that and picture agony, teeth grinding against unbearable pain, and while there is certainly anguish in the picture, the gnashing part specifically points at something else, something arguably more disturbing. Elsewhere in the Bible, when people gnash their teeth, it is not primarily an expression of pain but of rage, of fury and hatred boiling over. There is a scene where a crowd, hearing something they violently reject, gnashes its teeth at the speaker in pure incensed anger before turning on him. That is the flavour of the gesture, which reframes the whole image in an unsettling way. On this reading, the condemned are not depicted as broken sinners weeping in remorse, desperate for a second chance and finally sorry. They are depicted as still furious, still defiant, still hating, their teeth clenched not in penitence, but in ongoing rage against God even from within their fate. The despair is real, but it is not the despair of repentance. It is the despair of people who would still, given the chance, refuse. Poetically, you could say they go on burning with their own bitterness, the fire on the outside merely matching the fire they carried in. And here I should flag, in fairness, that this is an interpretation of the phrase rather than a spelled-out doctrine, and readers weigh it differently, but it fits the wider biblical use of the gesture strikingly well. Now for a genuinely surprising detail, one that shifts the whole moral picture of this place. The lake of fire was not, according to the text, originally built for human beings at all. When Jesus describes it, he specifies that it was prepared for the devil and his angels, the fallen spirits, the rebels from the very beginning of our story. In other words, the accommodations were designed with an entirely different tenant in mind. This was meant to be the final containment for the rebellion among the spiritual beings, the ultimate destination for the ringleaders of everything that went wrong. It was never, in its original purpose, a place engineered to receive people, and that recasts how humans end up there. They are not the intended residents. They arrive on this account only by insisting on taking the very same road the original rebels took, by aligning themselves, in the end, with the side the place was actually built for. There is a real tragedy folded into that detail, and it is worth naming rather than rushing past. A place designed for one kind of being, ending up occupied by another, is a picture of something going wrong that did not have to. The rebellion among the spirits was, on this account, a settled matter with a fitting end already prepared for it. Human beings were never part of that original equation. The whole long rescue we have traced, the descent, the opened road, the returned tree of life, the raised bodies, exist precisely so that people would not have to share the fate of the rebels, and so anyone who does end up there arrives, in a sense, against the entire thrust of the story, having turned down a rescue that was aimed squarely at keeping them out. It is not a fate the story wants for anyone. The whole map, as we are about to see in full, was built to point the other way. The Bible even lays out a rough order in which the various parties are cast into this final destination, a sequence of removals. First to go are the two great end-times villains, the beast and the figure who serves as his false prophet, thrown in at the climax of the earthly drama. Then, after that 1,000-year span we keep gesturing toward, the great enemy himself, the original defector, is thrown in after them, joining the fate that was, all along, prepared specifically for him. And then, at the great white throne, everyone whose name was not found in the registry of life follows. But the sequence does not even stop with the beings and the people. In one of the most striking images in the whole conclusion, death itself is thrown into the lake of fire, personified and abolished, the last enemy finally destroyed, which is a genuinely strange and wonderful thing to try to picture, the death of death, the end of ending. And there is one more removal that ties directly back to the map we have been drawing this entire time. Remember the old waiting room of the dead and the bottomless prison of the fallen, those two temporary holding areas we spent so long describing. At this final stage, they too are emptied out and cast into the lake of fire. The temporary containers are themselves discarded once their purpose is served. The interim places, the cells and the waiting rooms, are not permanent features of reality. They were always scaffolding, and at the end the scaffolding comes down and goes into the fire, along with everything else that was only ever meant to be temporary. Step back and notice what this final round of removals actually accomplishes for the cosmos as a whole. One by one, every source and every container of what went wrong is gathered up and disposed of. The ringleaders, the deceivers, the unregistered, the temporary prisons, and finally death itself, all of it removed from the picture in a single sweeping act of house cleaning. What is being described is not merely the punishment of the guilty, but the thorough purging of the entire creation, the removal of every last trace of the thing that broke it in the first place. When it is done, there is nothing corrupt left anywhere. No lingering pockets of the old damage, no holding cells still occupied, no death still stalking around. The universe is, for the first time since the fall, completely and permanently clean, which is exactly the condition it needs to be in for what comes next, because you do not move into a renewed world while the old rot is still lying around in the corners. The Bible has a name for this ultimate fate, and it is one of the more chilling phrases in the whole book, the second death. The idea is that everyone experiences the first death, the ordinary one, the separation of the two halves we discussed at the very start of our journey. But this is a second one, a further and more final severance, and with it, everything temporary in the entire story comes to an end. It is worth noting honestly, for the sake of fairness, that sincere Christians have long debated the precise nature of this final fate, whether it means unending conscious existence in that state, or a final and total end of the condemned, or something else again, and thoughtful people who all take the text seriously land in genuinely different places on that question. We are describing the traditional and most widely held picture, but the debate is real and worth acknowledging rather than papering over. What is not really in dispute is the weight of it, the finality, the sense that this is where all the temporary things run out. But we are not going to end our journey standing at the edge of that lake, because the story most emphatically does not end there, and it would be a genuine disservice to leave you in the dark half of the map when the whole thing has been building this entire time toward light. Because here is what almost nobody realizes about the ending. While all that judgment is being carried out, a second and far happier story has been unfolding in parallel. The story of the third and final form of paradise, the one that every earlier form was only ever a preview of. And it is this, not the fire, that the whole map has been aiming at from the very first page. It begins with that 1,000-year span we have been deliberately circling for chapters now, and it is time to finally open it up, at least a little. During this stretch, with the great enemy bound and sealed in the pit, unable to deceive the nations for the duration, the resurrected faithful, now in their glorified bodies, are described as reigning alongside Christ. This is not a passive retirement in the clouds. It is an active role, a genuine responsibility, and on one reading their task during this era is preparatory, a matter of setting both the spiritual and the physical worlds in order, getting everything ready for the great reunion that is coming. I should note plainly that the 1,000 years is one of the single most debated topics in the entire religion, with several major and thoughtful positions on what it means, whether it is a literal future era or a symbolic way of describing something else, and honest believers have argued about it for a very long time. We are following one reasonable reading of it, but this is firmly in pencil, not permanent ink. The idea that the resurrected faithful have preparatory work to do during that span is worth pausing on, because it fits a pattern we have watched all along. Nothing in this story happens by an instant magic wave. The reunion of the two realms, the physical and the spiritual, has been a stage process from the very beginning, one careful step after another. So it makes a certain sense that the final joining would also have a preparatory phase, a period of setting things in order, readying both sides of the seam for the total merger to come. On this reading, the glorified faithful are not idle royalty, enjoying an early retirement, but active participants in the last stage of the great repair, given real responsibility in getting creation ready for its wedding. Whatever the exact truth of the 1,000 years turns out to be, that picture of the rescued being handed a share in finishing the rescue is a quietly dignifying one. However that debate resolves, the destination it leads toward is described in glorious and specific detail, and this is where the whole story lands. The old order finally passes away, and something genuinely new is made, a new heaven and a new earth. Notice that phrase carefully, because it matters enormously. The ending is not the destruction of the physical world and an escape into some purely spiritual cloud realm, which is what a lot of people vaguely assume heaven means. It is the renewal of creation, a new earth, a physical world remade, which fits everything we learned about the resurrection, and God's stubborn insistence on redeeming rather than discarding the material world he once called good. The physical is not abandoned at the end, it is renewed. This point deserves to be hammered home, because the popular picture of the afterlife gets it almost exactly backwards. Ask most people what heaven is, and they will describe something vaporous and disembodied, souls drifting on clouds in a purely spiritual realm, a place with no ground under it and no substance to it, floating and ethereal. The actual biblical ending is the opposite of that. It is solid. It is a new earth, a physical world, with a city you could walk through, streets you could stand on, a river you could drink from, and a tree bearing actual fruit. It has weight and texture and place. The destination is not an escape from the material world into a spiritual fog. It is the material world itself, remade and perfected and finally fused with the spiritual. This matters because it means the hope on offer is not the thin, bloodless one of becoming a ghost forever. It is the far richer hope of a real, embodied physical existence in a renewed creation. The kind of life we already know and love, minus everything that ever spoiled it. Clouds and harps were never really the point. A new world was, and down onto that new earth, out of heaven, descends a city, the centerpiece of the whole eternal picture, called the New Jerusalem. The description of it is almost overwhelming in its extravagance. Its streets are paved with pure gold, so translucent it is compared to glass, which quietly tells you something remarkable about the economy of the place. the substance human beings have fought and schemed and obsessed over for the whole of history, is used there as paving material, the stuff you walk on without a second thought. Its walls are built of and studded with precious stones, foundations of jewels, gates of pearl. Running through it is a river, described as the water of life, clear as crystal, flowing from the very presence of God. It is a picture of abundance so complete that the most valuable things we know are demoted to ordinary building supplies. And there, growing beside that river, right in the heart of the eternal city, stands the one feature this entire journey has been quietly tracking from the very beginning: the tree of life, the same tree that grew in the center of the first garden and gave unending life, the same tree that was sealed off behind guardians and a turning blade when the gate slammed shut at the fall, the same tree whose reappearance in the present paradise told us the shut door had begun to move. Here, at the very end, it stands fully in the open, no guardians, no flaming sword, no barrier of any kind, freely accessible at last, and it has changed. It is described as bearing not one harvest but 12, a fresh yield every month, endlessly fruitful, and its leaves are said to be for the healing of the nations. The signature we were told to watch for has resurfaced one final time, and its full presence here, out in the open and endlessly giving, is the clearest possible signal that the long reopening we have followed across the whole story is now complete. What was lost in the first garden is not merely restored but surpassed. The tree is back, and this time nothing at all stands between anyone and it. Just as telling as what this city contains is what it conspicuously lacks, because the list of absences reads like a summary of everything that ever went wrong being quietly undone. There is no curse in it, the ancient consequence of the fall finally lifted entirely. There is no night, no darkness at all. There is no need for the sun or for any lamp, and the reason given is breathtaking in its simplicity. God himself is the light of the place, so no other source is required, which makes it, if you want a dry way of putting it, the ultimate off-grid city, running entirely on the presence of God with a utility bill of precisely nothing. And perhaps most striking of all, there is no temple in it. Think about how strange that is. Every holy city in the ancient world was organized around its temple, the one sacred building where the divine presence was concentrated, and access to God was carefully mediated and restricted. And the eternal city does not have one. The reason is not that God is absent, but the exact opposite. There is no need for a special building to house his presence or manage access to it, because his presence now saturates the entire place without limit. The one structure every sacred city was supposed to have is missing for the best possible reason imaginable. And this brings us to the resolution of the deepest thread running through the entire journey, the one about the two realms and the seam between them. Recall the whole long arc of that door. In the first garden, the physical and the spiritual overlapped and touched. At the fall, they were split apart and walled off, and they have stayed divided through the entire story since. Each stage of the rescue pried that door a little further open, the descent, the present paradise, the resurrection, each one recovering a bit more. Here, at last, the process reaches its completion. In this new creation, the physical and the spiritual do not merely touch as they did in Eden, and they are not merely joined in individual resurrected bodies. The two entire realms fully and permanently merge into one. The wall does not just have a door in it anymore, the wall is gone. And the ultimate expression of that merging is the simplest and most staggering line in the whole conclusion. God comes down to dwell among people, permanently, and is seen face to face. The nearness that was lost when the garden gate closed, the easy presence we described so long ago, is not just recovered but perfected and made eternal. There is a profound shift buried in that phrase, seen face to face, and it is easy to skate right past. For the entire span of the story we have been telling, from the moment the garden gate closed, the relationship between people and God has been conducted across a gap, mediated, indirect, a matter of trusting what could not be plainly seen. Faith, by its very definition, has always meant holding on to something not directly in view. The whole present arrangement runs on it, but at the very end that changes completely. When God dwells among people and is seen face to face, faith as we have known it is not so much rewarded as rendered unnecessary, because you do not need faith to believe in something standing plainly in front of you. Sight simply replaces it. The gap that made faith necessary is gone, and with it goes the whole mode of relating at a distance that has defined every religious life ever lived. It is the difference between corresponding with someone by letter for a lifetime, and finally, at last, sitting in the same room with them. Everything that once had to be taken on trust becomes, in that moment, something you can simply see. The image the Bible reaches for to capture the sheer joy of this union is not a legal one or an architectural one, but a wedding, which is telling. The whole climax is portrayed as a marriage celebration, described as the wedding feast of the Lamb, the joining of Christ and his people, pictured as a bride at last united with the one she belongs to. It is the most intimate metaphor available in human experience. Two becoming one, deliberately chosen to describe a union that no longer has any distance or separation left in it at all. After the entire long story of a widening and then narrowing gap, the ending is not merely the closing of a door but a wedding, the most complete joining two parties can have, made permanent and unbreakable. That, and not fire and not judgment, is where the whole map has been pointing from the very first page. So look back now at the full span of what we have travelled. We began this journey with a whole scattered geography of realms, a set of distinct places on the map, the world of the dead with its two divided halves, the contested battlefield of our own planet, the first lost paradise, the present paradise above, the bottomless prison of the fallen, and the final lake, along with all the movement between them. A sprawling, layered, sometimes bewildering set of destinations and transitions, but watch what happens to all of that complexity in the end. When everything temporary has burned away and every scaffolding has come down, all of those realms collapse, in the final reckoning, into just two possible states. Complete and permanent separation from God, out beyond the walls with the discarded things, or complete and permanent union with him, inside the city, at the wedding, face to face, with the tree of life in full view and every last barrier gone. A whole crowded map at the start, two states at the end. Everything, in the last analysis, sorts into one or the other. It is a remarkably simple ending for such an elaborate map, and that simplicity is the entire point. All the layered geography, all the waiting rooms and prisons and forms of paradise, all the transitions and rescues and reversals were only ever the machinery of the story, the moving parts working toward a resolution. And the resolution turns out not to be complicated at all. When the machinery finally stops, what is left is not 7 things or a dozen things, but 2. Near or far, inside or outside, with him or without him. Every thread we have followed, every realm we have mapped, every arc we have traced, resolves into that single, stark, clarifying pair. The whole sprawling journey narrows at the very last to a fork with exactly 2 directions, which leaves exactly one question, and it is not really a question about the map at all anymore. It is a question for you. Every soul that has ever lived is, according to this whole story, travelling toward one of those 2 final states, and the story insists, gently but without flinching, that the road you're on is chosen rather than assigned, and that it is chosen here, in this life, on this side of the first death, with the time you actually have. So the honest question the whole map finally puts to the person looking at it is simply this: of those 2 eternal states, which one do you want to be your home, and what, if anything, are you going to do about it today rather than someday? That is the choice the entire journey has been quietly building toward, and it is one no one else can make on your behalf. If any of this has stirred something in you, if it has made you want to sit with these questions a little longer, then do exactly that, and know that the conversation does not have to end when this does. If you found this walk through the map worthwhile, consider leaving a like so others can find their way to it too, and subscribe if you would like to keep exploring these deeper questions together, because there is always another road on the map worth tracing next. Drop your own thoughts in the comments, wrestle with it, disagree, ask what you're still wondering about, and let the rest of the community here think it through right alongside you. Wherever in the world you're watching from, and whatever you end up making of all of it, thank you for travelling the whole long road with me, from that very last heartbeat all the way to the wedding at the end of everything.